Welcome to another quiet journey through the past. Tonight, as you rest your head and allow your breath to slow, we invite you to drift through the winding corridors of medieval history, a time shaped by faith, fear, power, and the quiet rhythms of everyday life. The scratch of quill on parchment, the fear of inquisitors' boots on cobbled streets, our topic, delicately framed, touches on one of history's most complex intersections: religion and myth, persecution and misunderstanding. You may have heard whispers of betrayal, but we won't stay there too long, and gently, let's step back in time where the flickering lamplight casts long shadows, and the scent of parchment and warm milk lingers in the night. We begin in the quiet corners of medieval towns where Jewish families tended to their homes and crafts, their prayers soft in the darkened synagogues, and finally, we will rise into the halls of power and belief where theologians, rulers, and the masses shaped destinies based not on what happened, but what they thought had happened. Instead, we'll explore the symbols, the artifacts, and the mysterious twists of culture that interwove religious traditions and historical misunderstandings. So now, find a comfortable position. Let your muscles soften. Segment 1. Daily life in medieval Jewish communities. Imagine yourself in a quiet medieval town, nestled along a river that babbles with a timeless rhythm. It's early morning. A thin mist hangs in the air, veiling the tiled rooftops and weather-worn shutters. Somewhere in a corner of this town, past the baker's chimney and the tolling bell of the monastery, there lies the Jewish quarter called, in many places, the Judangasa. The streets here are narrower, and the homes slightly smaller, but they are filled with life. A woman draws water from a communal well. She is wrapped in layers of wool and linen, a scarf tied securely over her hair. The water splashes gently into the bucket, a cool and steady sound. Town laws restrict movement. Christians and Jews rarely mingle freely. Rumors from the Christian quarter sometimes blow in like a chill wind. Accusations of strange rituals, whispers of betrayal from ancient times, long fossilized slanders that still flicker in torchlit sermons. But tonight, the shutters hold. The bed is warm, and the prayer said in quiet Hebrew still carries hope. There is always a tension and awareness that difference is watched and sometimes condemned. Outside, snow begins to fall, cloaking the Judangasa in a muffled stillness. The world beyond might burn with accusation, but here within these walls there is a quiet dignity, a devotion to tradition, a holding on, the sound of a people holding fast to who they are. No matter what shadows press at the edges, each morning begins anew with the wrapping of tefillin, the soft leather straps tied tightly to the arm and forehead, a physical bond to the divine. Into a time when myths and theology merged, and the weight of one ancient narrative of betrayal, trial, and crucifixion began to shape the destinies of those who were not there to speak for themselves. There is comfort in repetition, in law, in community, a constancy in a world that often treats them as strangers. Nearby, children chase each other past the butcher stall, their laughter rising briefly into the air before quieting again beneath the weight of daily rituals. Walls are often made of wattle and daub, the floors of packed earth or rough boards. In others, they are expelled or attacked, their properties seized, their synagogues desecrated. But even in these darker places, the daily rhythms persist. But even here, beauty exists: wooden shelves lined with books, clay oil lamps shaped with care, embroidered cloths for the Sabbath table. There's a worn charm to it all. Even the cracked teacup holds memories. Life in the Jewish quarter is governed by rhythms, both universal and unique: prayers 3 times a day, observance of the Sabbath, dietary laws, and the cycle of the Jewish calendar. Each week, Friday afternoon grows hushed and expectant. By sundown, candles are lit in small windows, their flames flickering behind thin glass panes or oiled parchment. Others are scribes, their hands ink-stained and precise, carefully copying Torah scrolls or religious commentaries. Their tasks are endless: kneading dough, preparing herbs, whispering lullabies passed down from mothers and grandmothers long gone. Education is valued deeply. Boys begin study at an early age, reciting ancient words with sing-song rhythm. The soft murmur of Hebrew, Aramaic, and vernacular tongues mixes with the creak of wooden floors and the rustle of parchment. Families gather, hands are washed, blessings are spoken. The scent of braided challah bread mingles with that of slow-cooked lentils or poultry stewing, aroma both grounding and sacred. Many Jewish men work as merchants, moneylenders, or physicians. The women tend to homes and children, but also play crucial roles as traders in markets, healers, and preservers of tradition. Yet life is not without unease. The Jewish quarter is often separated by gates, both literal and social. At night, after the household candles have burned low, a father might close the shutters a bit more tightly. Time passes slowly in the Jewish quarter. Jewish homes are modest. Furniture is sparse. In some places, Jewish communities are tolerated, even protected by kings and nobles who value their economic roles. A mother sings softly as she rocks a cradle. A scribe works by candlelight, copying the words of Isaiah. Evening comes again. The sky deepens into velvet. Another Sabbath begins. Another week ends. You can almost hear it, can't you? The soft clicking of dishes, the whispered blessing over wine, the scraping of chairs over wooden floors. And as we gently close this glimpse into daily life, let us drift now deeper into the heart of the medieval story, the origins of the betrayal narrative and its evolution in the Middle Ages. Let us now drift, with care and gentle attention, into the heart of a historical misunderstanding, one that begins not in the medieval period itself, but centuries earlier in a world shaped by the Roman Empire. Early Christianity and the slow, uneven formation of theological identity. We will walk softly through this story, not to indict or to accuse, but simply to observe how one narrative took root, grew over time, and became deeply entangled with medieval life, law, and belief. To begin, we must return to a dusty outpost of Roman governance, Judea, where, in the early 1st century of the Common Era, tensions simmered between the Roman state local leaders and a small, increasingly vocal movement of followers around a man known as Jesus of Nazareth. But as Christianity spread beyond Judea into Greece, Rome, and eventually into the heart of the empire itself, began to distinguish itself from its Jewish roots. Christianity transformed from a persecuted belief system into an institutional power. And with this power came the temptation to rewrite the story of its origins, to place blame elsewhere, and to simplify the past into a narrative that served present needs. These words, intended to solidify Christian identity and supremacy, slowly moved from theological metaphor into social stigma. Identity, after all, often forms an opposition. In these writings, we see hints of division, of betrayal, and of political fear. But among the figures of saints and angels, you might notice something darker: carvings or illustrations of Jewish figures with exaggerated features, gathered around the crucified Christ, often shown snarling or mocking. Historically, the Roman Empire executed criminals by crucifixion, not the local religious authorities. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, held the power and used it freely. Let us pause and listen to the quiet hum of time. Let us not rush. These performances were vivid. Crowds gathered in town squares. The script did not vary. You do not understand all the words, but you know what comes next. There will be boos and curses, and later perhaps the throwing of stones. Maybe worse. The message, repeated year after year, shaped the imagination of Christian Europe. Yet in later Christian interpretation, particularly in Europe, the focus slowly shifted. There were voices of reason monks and priests who cautioned against generalizing blame, rulers who offered protection, communities that coexisted in fragile peace. But the machinery of narrative is slow to change. For many medieval Christians, the betrayal of Jesus was not a historical moment. It was a perpetual condition. Jews were barred from holding office, from owning land, from living in certain towns. But most of all, it shaped the silence that fell between communities. A silence heavy with misunderstanding, because of what had happened 2,000 years earlier. But because of what others believed had happened, they were forced to wear identifying badges, to pay special taxes, to convert or be expelled. He is aware of the stories spoken outside his door. He hears the sermons, he sees the pictures. But still, he writes, still he teaches, still he believes. Each one deepened the chasm between peoples who, in truth, shared far more than they realized. The Jews, it was believed, bore a collective guilt. In our next part, we will step into mystery, into the symbols, the scrolls, the tombs, and the odd tales that still whisper through medieval soil, not just those of the 1st century, but all Jews across time. Early theological voices began to emphasize the role of the Pharisees, the temple priests, and eventually, more broadly and inaccurately, the Jewish people as a whole. And it was from this theological root that laws, persecutions, and expulsions would grow. But what stands out, as the centuries progressed, was one troubling refrain: that certain Jewish authorities had played a role in Jesus' death. The events of Jesus' life and death are recorded, with variation and perspective, in the Christian Gospels texts written decades after his crucifixion. The Church, increasingly powerful, often needed a theological other, and Jews, living apart, practicing distinct customs. Refusing to convert were an ever-present reminder of the past that Christianity claimed to fulfill and supersede. It is a complicated matter. This did not happen overnight. In the first centuries after Jesus' death, Christianity remained a small, persecuted sect within the Roman world. Many of its early leaders were Jewish themselves. By the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine had converted to Christianity, and the faith became not only legal but favored. This marked a turning point. It was in this context that the idea of the Jews as the killers of Christ began to harden. Early church fathers, such as John Chrysostom, gave fiery sermons denouncing Jews as God-killers, rhetoric that would echo in pulpits and writings for centuries to come. By the early medieval period, this idea had become more than doctrinate, had become policy. Let us now enter a 12th century cathedral. The light filters through stained glass windows, painting the stone walls with gentle hues of blue and crimson. These were not just artistic flourishes, they were expressions of belief. This notion, known as perpetual deicide, became a cornerstone of Christian anti-Jewish sentiment in the Middle Ages. But still, even here, in this moment of injustice, this belief in betrayal did not exist in a vacuum. It was fed by economic tension, religious insecurity, and a human tendency to simplify complex truths. Thus, the story of betrayal became a tool, a way to explain why Jews had not accepted Jesus, a way to warn the faithful against heresy, and a way to justify social marginalization. It crept into plays performed during Easter week, passion dramas in which Jews were cast as villains, shouting angrily, while Christ, passive and suffering, accepted his fate. Imagine yourself as a Jewish child in 13th century France, watching from a shadowed alleyway as townspeople gather to see this tale unfold. This is how stories shape lives. Over time, the betrayal narrative fused with other myths, the blood libel, in which Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use their blood in rituals, or the host's desecration accusation, which claimed Jews stabbed communion wafers to re-crucify Christ. Each of these stories built upon the original accusation of betrayal. Each one further isolated Jewish communities. But even in the darkest shadows, there are flickers of light. Not all Christians believed the myths. The betrayal myth found its way into law. By the late Middle Ages, many of Europe's Jewish communities lived under the weight of this story knot, and yet, through it all, they endured. The betrayal narrative became a lens through which medieval Christians viewed not only their own faith, but their neighbors. It shaped theology, it shaped art, it shaped fear. Let your mind settle here, just for a moment. Imagine again the Jewish scribe, copying holy texts beneath candlelight. This is not a story of one betrayal. It is the story of a world struggling to understand itself and, sometimes choosing simplicity over truth. As the candles burn low and the cathedral bells toll softly in the distance, let us now leave this segment of belief and blame behind. Let the betrayal myth fade for a time, and follow instead the winding path of forgotten clues and cultural entanglements. Mystery, Archaeology, and Culture. Part 1. Lost Texts, Sacred Languages, and the Quiet Whispers of Hidden Knowledge. Now let us wander gently into the hushed realm of mystery. It's not the sharp-edged mystery of sudden revelations or thrilling secrets, but rather the slow, subtle kind, the kind that emerges quietly from the earth, from dusty manuscripts buried in forgotten corners of monasteries, from fading inscriptions on the lintels of ancient homes, from the layers of language and memory that ripple just beneath the surface of the known. The only sound is the slow turning of pages, the occasional creak of a wooden floorboard, and the soft scratching of a quill on vellum. Here, nestled behind locked cabinets and within heavy tomes, are pieces of history rarely told. They whisper of customs misunderstood, symbols mistranslated, and rituals that once had meaning, but were over time distorted by the distance between faiths and the fog of centuries. Imagine yourself in a quiet medieval library. The air is cool and dry, filled with the faint scent of old parchment and beeswax polish. Monasteries sometimes commissioned Latin translations of Jewish writings, such as the Talmud, not out of reverence, but to better attack them in public debate. It is not linear. It is a tapestry of law, story, interpretation, and spiritual philosophy, preserved through oral tradition and later committed to writing. To those outside the Jewish tradition, it could appear opaque, even chaotic, and this unfamiliarity often bred misunderstanding. Let us begin with the Hebrew language itself. Jewish scholars of the Middle Ages typically did not discuss Jesus at all. Their writings were not about Christian theology. They were about Jewish law, community, ethics, and spirituality. The obsession with Jewish books and language came mostly from outside. It was part of a broader pattern, the projection of fear onto mystery. These claims, often distorted or fabricated, led to the burning of Talmudic manuscripts in several cities. In Paris, in the year 1242, 24 cartloads of handwritten Talmudic volumes were confiscated and set alight, though not as central in medieval Judaism as it would become in later centuries. This six-pointed star appeared on manuscripts, synagogue walls, and ceremonial objects. In Christian lands, where the cross reigned supreme as the religious symbol, the geometric precision of the star seemed foreign, coded. Some believed Jews held secret texts, books of spells or summoning, keys to powers that defied natural law. Of course, this was myth-woven from the threads of envy, ignorance, and the medieval love of wonder. The flames must have cast long shadows over the cobbled square echoes of the crackling pages swallowed by fire. But to some medieval Christians, it looked like an occult object, something secretive, magical. Their knowledge of herbs, of bodily humors, of long-preserved Arabic medical texts made them indispensable. In times of plague or illness, Christian towns sometimes turned to Jewish doctors. In the absence of understanding, many sought scapegoats. Rumors spread that Jews were conspiring to destroy Christendom. Entire communities were massacred. Christian scholars sometimes read these poems, quietly admiring their beauty while denouncing their origins. The irony was not lost on the poets. The Christian child watching a Jewish wedding from afar, the Jewish boy peeking into a cathedral during Mass. We have seen how mystery becomes fear when not accompanied by understanding. The sounds, the smells, the rituals, all so different, and yet, beneath it all, a shared longing for meaning, for protection from a world that was often uncertain. And yet, when panic set in, these same communities turned against them, accusing them of poisoning wells or invoking curses. Yet this same expertise drew suspicion. How could a Jew heal so effectively? Was it science or sorcery? Stories circulated that Jews performed rituals at their doorposts. Some said they murmured incantations. Others believed the small scrolls carried hidden spells. In the Christian medieval world, Hebrew was often viewed not as a sacred tongue, but as a dangerous wana language of secrets, of obscured power. Ancient mikvehs rediscovered beneath taverns, tombstones with dual scripts, and objects that bore quiet witness to centuries of interwoven lives. A small case, affixed to the doorposts of Jewish homes, containing a scroll of parchment inscribed with verses from Deuteronomy. It is touched when one enters or leaves a room, a quiet gesture of remembrance. Signs of curiosity, of dialogue even. Christian Hebraists in Spain and Italy sometimes corresponded, secretly, with Jewish scholars. There were debates held in courts, formal disputes, in which rabbis and priests discussed theology. Often these were staged, their outcomes predetermined, but not always. For many Christians, Hebrew was the language of the people who had, in their eyes, rejected the Messiah. Thus, its characters, its cadences, its sacred scriptures were approached with both fascination and suspicion. To most medieval Christians, Hebrew was unreadable, a script of curls and strokes, moving from right to left, carrying meanings they could not access. And yet, it was known that this was the language of the Old Testament, the very foundation of Christian scripture. This created a kind of tension. On the one hand, scholars desired to study Hebrew to better understand their own sacred texts. On the other, there lingered a fear that delving too deeply into Jewish knowledge could lead one astray. This fear was not entirely abstract. Across medieval Europe, there were occasional attempts by Christian theologians to learn Hebrew to preserve Jewish wisdom, but to refute it. But the Talmud is not a simple book. It is vast, made of thousands of pages, compiled over centuries. Some Christian polemicists claim that the Talmud was filled with blasphemies against Jesus, yet the mystery remains. What did the Christians think they saw in those pages, and what did they miss? There are traces of Jesus in the Talmud, but they are obscure, symbolic, and debated, and that mystery extended beyond words. Let us turn now to symbols. Consider, if you will, the mezuzah misunderstood in Christian lands. To Jewish families, the mezuzah was a blessing, a sign of faith, a protection rooted in Scripture. Misunderstanding bred suspicion. Even the Star of David, or Magen David, was viewed with curiosity. And so, once again, projection took over. There were also rumors deeply unfounded that Jews possessed magical knowledge passed down from King Solomon. Man revered in both the Jewish and Christian traditions, but myths are persistent. In parts of Germany and France, Jewish physicians were both sought after and feared. A quiet contradiction unfolded. Jewish knowledge was simultaneously needed and condemned. The Black Death of the 14th century, which decimated Europe's population, provides one such tragic example. But let us breathe here. Let us return to the calm of the library. There are other mysteries, quieter ones. Manuscripts hidden behind false walls. Hebrew texts with Latin glosses written in monastic script. In some corners of Europe, cultural exchange persisted in the shadows. Jewish poets wrote in Arabic, in Hebrew, in Judeo-Spanish. Their metaphors were rich, their visions deeply spiritual. And perhaps the most persistent mystery was the shared silence between two worlds living side by side, yet never truly meeting. In this first part of our exploration, we have wandered among texts and translations, among doorposts and scrolls, among fires both literal and metaphorical. And now, gently, we will continue deeper. In the next part, we will explore material artifact synagogues buried beneath cities. Let the dust settle around you. Let the candles flicker a bit lower. The past is not gone. It waits beneath our feet, within forgotten drawers, in the faded ink of overlooked books. And so, we move forward. Unearthing silence, hidden mikvehs, vanished synagogues, and the traces beneath our feet, let us continue. Let the air grow a little cooler now, as we descend, slowly and gently. Perhaps the building is now a cafe, or a tailor's shop, or stands vacant, its windows, shuttered and quiet. It was not merely a place for washing the body, but a symbol of spiritual renewal and continuity with ancient law. A mother descending in quiet reflection, a bride preparing for her wedding, a scholar's wife pausing at the edge of the water. These were rarely grand buildings. Others were converted into churches, granaries, homes. But occasionally, their bones remain. In Spain, for instance, the synagogue of El in Toledo still stands, its walls adorned with stunning stucco Arabic floral patterns interwoven with Hebrew inscriptions. The beauty of the building reflects a fleeting moment of coexistence during the era of Lacan Viventuan Muslims, Christians, and Jews, shared cities, if not equality. But beneath the floorboards, something lingers. Their voices, when preserved at all, were often filtered through the writings of others, clerics, chroniclers, accusers. Its purpose unknown. A token of betrothal, perhaps. In places like York and Lincoln, archaeologists have found traces of Jewish presence not through grand architecture, but through smaller klus fragments of pottery, remnants of kosher kitchens, burial sites oriented carefully toward Jerusalem. In this second part of our quiet journey through mystery, we turn our attention to the archaeological, those physical remnants of Jewish life in the Middle Ages that were hidden. There is dignity in that. Imagine yourself in the cellar of an old European house. The walls are stone, worn smooth by centuries of touch and change. Mystery was often a necessity, the rituals that, despite difference, often overlapped. We will see how mystery is not only found in division, but sometimes in quiet, unnoticed unity. The inscriptions on stone, they tell us not just what happened, but what was valued, what was feared, what was sacred. In a world where exposure could mean accusation, secrecy became protection. Traditions were preserved quietly, celebrations held discreetly. When Christian holidays approached, especially Holy Week, many Jews retreated into their homes, knowing that the betrayal narrative would be retold and tension might rise. The verse drawn from Psalm 121 spoke of the Lord who watches over your coming and going. They endured. Still, they built. Still, let your breath slow again. Let your thoughts wander. Gently, through narrow streets and long-buried walls, The past is still there, beneath your feet. Whispering, they prayed. Tucked into a child's garment, sewn into the hem of a traveler's cloak, we can only guess. The gravestones were usually modest stone slabs inscribed with Hebrew names, prayers, and blessings for the soul. Many were later looted or destroyed. Some were used as building materials. Others were covered by new construction, forgotten beneath roads and houses. The Torah scrolls buried in a secret place during a time of persecution, never recovered. The community records marriages, births, deaths lost in a fire or swept away by a flood. The mikveh was central to Jewish life. In cities like Speyer, Worms, and Cologne, in medieval Germany centers of Ashkenazi, Jewish life mikvehs were built deep underground. The stones, though worn by weather and time, still whisper names, still hold fragments of identity, of longing, of endurance, temperature, and preservation of sacred function. And yet, centuries later, when these cities were restructured, when walls fell and foundations were repurposed, many of these mikvehs were forgotten until someone renovating a building or digging a new cellar would stumble upon the carved steps and realize that a story had been preserved. Close your eyes and picture those stone steps now. Now, let us step above ground. The medieval synagogue was a place not only of prayer, but of study, of gathering, of instruction. Some synagogues were destroyed in waves of violence, but such moments were fragile. In England, few traces of medieval synagogues survive. The Jewish population was expelled in 1290 by King Edward I, and with their departure came the repurposing of their communal spaces. It is in these cemeteries that silence speaks loudest. Jewish burial grounds in the Middle Ages were often located beyond the city walls, a place of separation, but also of sanctity. But in recent decades, some of these have been rediscovered. In Prague, in Erfurt, in parts of France and Poland, work crews digging new foundations have uncovered old Jewish cemeteries. And sometimes, archaeologists find something stranger still. In the city of Oxford, England, in the 2010s, construction unearthed what appeared to be a medieval Jewish ritual space, perhaps even a house with sacred objects still buried beneath. These objects, these fragments, are pieces of a puzzle that was never meant to be solved. Archaeology then becomes a kind of justice, a quiet recovery. Let us now imagine a quieter mystery. A merchant's weight scale discovered in a cellar in Marseille, bearing both Latin and Hebrew inscriptions. Was it used in fair trade across communities? Or consider the small wooden amulet discovered in mines. It bore the name Eliezer, carved on one side, and a protective verse on the other. There is mystery, too, in what is not found. The synagogue that once stood in a village now vanished without a trace. Each stone turned, and yet, for Jewish communities in the Middle Ages, still and now, let the earth settle again. Let the dust return gently to its resting place. Let the cool stone breathe once more. In our next and final part of this segment, we will explore the shared cultural spaces, the music, the foods, the garments, for now. Shared spaces, forgotten sounds, where cultures touched, echoed, and overlapped. Now we turn to the quietest mystery of all, the one not hidden in flames or buried beneath stone, but whispered between doorways. Passed through aromas in the marketplace, hummed beneath one's breath during the slow rhythm of daily chores. Of quiet overlap, not through violence or grand gestures, but through culture. The light is pale, touching the stones with gold. Merchants set up their stalls, some Jewish, some Christian, laying out wares on worn cloths or simple wooden tables. There are spices, textiles, dried fruit, leatherwork, soap, even jars of honey and vinegar. Through sound, smell, flavor, color. Through the ordinary, the mystery of how two very different communities, Christian and Jewish, living side by side in walled towns, divided by law and belief, could nonetheless shape one another in subtle, persistent ways. The Jewish tailor next door hangs dyed fabrics in the doorway of his shop. Further down the street, the soft singing of Lecha Dodia Jewish hymn rises from behind closed shutters. The notes are different, the words unknown to the outsider, but the cadence, the rise and fall, is familiar. These are the sounds of lives lived near one another, influenced by the same seasons, the same winds. A gentle murmur fills the air, a mingling of Latin, Old French, Hebrew, and German. Words float by, some strange, some familiar. Christian children learned Yiddish slang from their playmates. Jewish cooks sometimes borrowed ingredients from Christian neighbors. A Christian woman preparing winter stew might use preserved herbs she bought from a Jewish merchant. The braided bread, known as challah, may have influenced or been influenced by similar Christian loaves made for holy days. Fried pastries, often associated with Hanukkah, resemble local treats found in both Christian and Muslim communities. Jewish women adorned their Sabbath tables with fabrics bought from Christian traders. Christian nobles sometimes wore jewelry crafted by Jewish artisans. Again and again, culture refused to be confined. Even the humble dumpling, so beloved in Ashkenazi Jewish cooking, has cousins in nearly every medieval kitchen. A Jewish family might make sweet pastries using techniques borrowed from Andalusian neighbors. Recipes were rarely written down. Both communities marked the coming of spring, the harvest of grapes, the approach of winter's cold. During Sukkot, Jewish families built temporary shelters adorned with greenery and fruit decoing. In some ways, the Christian harvest festivals held around the same time. In Germany, Judeo-German eventually evolved into Yiddish-rich, complex language of prayer, poetry, business, and everyday life. These languages carried traces of their surroundings, just as their speakers carried traces of shared streets and shared time. Not identical, not shared, but parallel, resonant. They were periodically expelled from cities and kingdoms, blamed for plagues and storms and rumors of betrayal. The walls were real. These were meant to mark separation, but the everyday clothing worn beneath these signs often mirrored the styles of the surrounding society. Long tunics, layered cloaks, linen undergarments. A Jewish scholar in 12th century England would have looked in silhouette, not so different from a Christian scribe. Christian fasting and Jewish kosher laws may seem distinct, but both imposed structure on life: when to eat, what to eat, how to honor the sacred through nourishment. They passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, across walls and through shared marketplaces. A spring near a Jewish cemetery might be known as a healing place by Christians. They were never codified by councils or councils, but they were felt, they were lived. A Christian well might bear a Hebrew inscription from long ago. Lamps are lit, casting warm light on stucco walls. The mystery is in how people lived together, apart, how they influenced each other without admitting it, how they sang in different tongues, but sometimes to the same rhythm. The bride wears embroidered silk, her face partly veiled, a tune that lingered after it was heard through a wall. The groom approaches with musicians playing reed flutes and stringed instruments. Neighbors watch from windows, some Jewish, some Christian. The songs sung that night are ancient, but their melodies hold faint echoes of local tunes. The guests eat sweets flavored with honey and almonds, similar to those made in Christian homes just down the lane. A melody hummed during chores might pass from one home to another, and in time become part of both. Let your mind wander softly now to a medieval town square just after sunrise. The Christian baker dusts flour from his hands as he carries trays of warm loaves, and in this moment, the line between the sacred and the mundane begins to blur. We often imagine the boundaries between cultures as firm, but in truth, they are porous. Even religious life so, strictly separated in doctrines, sometimes echoed across these invisible walls. In Spain, under Muslim rule, Jewish and Muslim musical forms coexisted and sometimes overlapped. Jewish poets set their religious verses to Arabic scales and Andalusian rhythms. In Ashkenazi communities of Northern Europe, certain prayer chants closely resembled Gregorian tonal patterns. Was this imitation, adaptation, or simply the unconscious consequence of sharing the same soundscape? Take music, for instance. The melodies sung in Jewish synagogues during the Middle Ages were deeply influenced by the musical traditions of the surrounding Christian and Islamic worlds. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval town at dusk. Bells toll for Christian vespers. Now imagine the kitchen. Food is perhaps the most persistent cultural mystery, the one that crosses boundaries without permission. Some foods that were once uniquely Jewish became part of wider European cuisine. Yet beyond ingredients and recipes lies something more intimate. The rhythm of meals, the symbolism of food, and then there is clothing. Here again, difference and similarity met quietly. Medieval Christian authorities often demanded that Jews dress in identifiable waziello badges, pointed hats, textile dyes, weaving patterns, and even embroidery techniques crossed communities. Even calendars, so central to religious identity, occasionally aligned. Though Jewish and Christian holidays followed different cycles, the agricultural seasons were the same. Language, too, tells a tale of quiet overlap. In southern France and parts of Italy, Jews spoke Judeo-Provençal, a dialect blending Hebrew with the regional Romance tongue. Let us now picture a Jewish wedding in medieval Spain. It is held in a private courtyard just past sunset. And here lies the mystery not of conflict, but of quiet connection. Even when law forbade it, even when fear divided hearts, daily life made contact inevitable. A borrowed word, a shared tool. This does not erase the real boundaries that existed. Jews were restricted by law, harassed by officials, and often isolated by decree. But between those walls, life happened. And in the smallest gestures, buying grain from a neighbor, hiring a local stonemason, borrowing a spindle culture crossed the barriers that theology had tried to build. Even in death, traces of this overlap remain. In some cemeteries, Jewish and Christian graves stand closer than we imagine. Sometimes the same stonemason carved both. In others, local legends entwined both communities. These were not stories recorded in grand chronicles. And now, centuries later, they wait for us not to solve them, but to feel their gentle weight. As we conclude this third segment of mystery, archaeology and culture, let us sit for a moment in this in-between space, between sound and silence, between memory and forgetting, between what was and what was never quite allowed to be. The mystery is not in a hidden chamber, or a buried scroll, or a forgotten tomb, though all those remain. Let that thought settle in your mind like evening mist. Soon, we will rise from this quiet world and move gently into our final segment, where we will examine how power, wealth, and elite ideas about difference helped solidify the divisions that daily life tried so gently to blur. But for now, rest here in the soft shadows of shared culture. The hush between the hymns, social, elite, contrasting daily life thrones, altars, and the burden of distinction now. Let us rise from the narrow streets and quiet courtyards of daily life and look upward toward the high windows of castles and cathedrals. Toward the figures who shaped law, policy, and doctrine, kings in fur-lined robes, bishops in gilded vestments, scribes with sharpened quills drafting decrees by candlelight. The scent of wax and parchment hangs in the air. A clerk reads aloud a letter from the archbishop. There is concern about the Jews in the city, about their growing influence in trade, about rumors of secret meetings, about their refusal to convert. The king listens, impassive. His mind turns not to doctrine, but to revenue. It is here, in these lofty chambers, that many of the divisions between Christian and Jewish life in the Middle Ages were not only preserved, but sharpened. Imagine yourself in the chamber of a medieval monarch. The walls are draped in tapestry, but always foreign. They were useful to rulers, especially as financiers, because Christian law, at the time, placed strict restrictions on lending money with interest. The church considered it usury, a sin. But rulers needed loans to build castles, to wage wars, to settle debts. In England, they were declared property of the crown, either full citizens nor fully alien. This royal protection meant safety of a sort. These were not yet the ghettos of early modern Europe, but the idea had begun. Jewish homes clustered together, often near the market, sometimes enclosed by gates. Before him stands a rabbi, summoned to explain why his community has resisted recent efforts at conversion. The rabbi is calm, composed. He speaks with humility, quoting from Scripture. The bishop listens, but the decision has already been made. A disputation will be arranged. The outcome is predetermined. The rabbi may speak, but he will not be heard. The Christian elite described this as protection from violence, from spiritual contagion. Often, they relied on Christian converts from Judaism to act as interrogators. These debates were more performance than inquiry, staged for the benefit of nobles and clergy. They reinforced elite confidence that Christianity was supreme and that Judaism was both stubborn and obsolete. They issued charters of protection, sometimes in exchange for taxes. These charters spelled out rights and restrictions, where Jews could live, what they could sell, when they could appear in court. Every detail was controlled, every liberty was conditional, but the result was clear. A visible line between them and us. Ecclesia stood upright, crowned, holding a cross. Synagoga stood slumped, blindfolded, her crown fallen, the tablets of Moses slipping from her hands. This was not subtle. It was doctrine in stone. but it also meant exposure. When kings needed funds, they could tax Jewish communities heavily. We will see how elites sometimes used theology to justify power, and how Jewish communities responded, not with violence, but with ritual, education, and the steady preservation of identity, that they bore collective guilt for Christ's death, that their continued existence was a test of Christian patience, a necessary suffering until the end of days. The bishop is present, flanked by clergy. A crowd gathers not for punishment, but for something else. A public conversion. Let the echo of sermons and decrees fade behind us. He has lived in the city for decades, known by Christian neighbors, a demonstration that the system worked. That error could be corrected, that the old covenant had finally given way to the new. Now, dressed in white robes, he renounces his faith and accepts baptism. Others after threats to property or family. In Spain, during the later Middle Ages, the pressure became systemic. Jews were encouraged then, increasingly forced to convert. Those who did became conversos Christians, yet they were never fully accepted. Water is poured over his head. Bells ring. The crowd murmurs, a mixture of reverence, suspicion, and quiet satisfaction. We now move into the space of resilience. It was a chilling twist. People persecuted for faith, then persecuted again for the suspicion of still holding it. This message trickled down from cathedral to chapel, from monastery to village church. Were they sincere? Did they still observe Jewish rites in secret? The term crypto-Jew arose, suggesting that belief, once formed, never fully disappears. Entire families lived under watch, some were interrogated, others denounced by neighbors. They were given no more than a few months to sell their property and depart. Synagogues were closed, cemeteries abandoned, charters revoked. Each time, some were allowed to return, usually for economic reasons, only to be expelled again. In parts of Germany, waves of violence often preceded formal removal. In Spain, the final expulsion came in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree. Jews had the choice: convert, leave, or die. When public resentment arose, rulers could turn that resentment away from themselves and toward the Jewish lenders they had relied upon. Men tighten the straps on barrels filled with household goods. Women carry bundles of cloth, coins hidden in hems. They are waiting for boats to carry them away. Jewish financiers became convenient instruments of royal finance, between decrees, between the slow sweep of history's grand pronouncements and the quiet decisions made at hearth and table. The woman of the house lights to flames. She covers her eyes. She recites a blessing. The candles flicker against the wall, their glow both fragile and persistent. The name of the town they left, the prayer they sang in its synagogue, the sound of the rabbi's voice at a wedding. These memories became portable sanctuaries. In places where observance was forbidden, families would still find a way. A hidden oven, a trusted neighbor. The preservation of a meal becomes an act of defiance, not in councils, but in courtyards. In this second part, we examine the ways in which the elite power structures of medieval Europe sought to control, convert, or expel Jewish populations. Of scribes copying sacred texts late into the night, with windows shuttered and lamps low, in one famous example, the Barcelona Haggadah, Hebrew letters bloom with floral designs. Passover scenes are rendered with color and care. The book was not meant for public display. It was used at home, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. These were not grand revolts. They were slow acts of fidelity, and how those populations, in turn, responded not with rebellion, but with endurance. And here, we encounter one of the central ironies of Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe. We will see how Judaism, as imagined by the Christian elite, served not just as a scapegoat, but as a mirror. Jewish communities were often considered necessary. After the Spanish expulsion, many fled to the Ottoman Empire, where they were welcomed, in Constantinople, Salonika, and Smyrna. Ladina, the Judeo-Spanish language, blended the memory of Iberia with new realities. A Jewish father closes the shutters of his home. In their minds are very different texts, but the day has shaped them both. A girl named Simha Joy, despite mourning. These names were not chosen lightly. They were declarations, a reminder that continuity outlasts kings. This created a fragile and dangerous relationship. Jews were placed under direct protection of kings in many parts of Europe. The resentment grew not only from debt, but from separation. The Church, increasingly powerful in the later Middle Ages, codified Jewish difference through law. Councils decreed that Jews must wear distinguishing marks, a yellow badge in France, a special hat in parts of Germany. They were prohibited from holding public office, from owning Christian slaves, from building new synagogues in many regions. These laws were not simply spiritual declarations, they were tools of control, and they were mirrored in social policy. In some cities, Jews were confined to particular quarters. Let us walk now, with quiet steps, into the court of a bishop. He is seated in a large, echoing chamber, surrounded by advisors. These public disputations held in Paris, in Barcelona, in Rome were intended to prove Christian truth by challenging Jewish thought. From the pulpit, sermons reinforced the message. Priests and bishops told their congregations that Jews were blind to the truth. Art mirrored this doctrine. In many cathedrals, sculptures and stained glass depicted ecclesia and synagoga, personifications of church and synagogue. And yet, the elite strategy was not always violent. Many rulers saw themselves as guardians of order. They allowed Jews to live within their realms and their conditions. This contrast between elite control and daily interdependence shaped medieval Jewish life. At the top, kings and clergy defined difference. At the bottom, bakers and blacksmiths shared streets and transactions. Let that tension settle in your thoughts. Let your breath move softly. In the next part, we will descend again to the world of expulsions, conversions, and cultural resistance. Let the halls of power grow quiet. Conversion, expulsion, and the quiet resistance of ritual. We return now to palaces or pulpits, but to the spaces in between. Between walls, let us begin in the cathedral square. It is a festival day. Banners flutter in the breeze. A wooden platform has been erected. A Jewish man, perhaps elderly, stands before the crowd. These conversions, often heavily publicized, were symbols. To the Church, they were victories not just of theology, but of order. And yet, not all conversions were willing. Many occurred under pressure. Some came after imprisonment. Here lies a particular cruelty. A converted Jew might change his name, attend Mass, learn Latin prayers, but suspicion remained, and in 1478, the Spanish Inquisition was established. Its purpose was not to target Jews by then. Most had been expelled, but to monitor those who had converted. But centuries before the Inquisition, expulsions had already begun. Let us walk now, slowly, along the riverbank of York, England, in the year 1290. The sky is overcast. A group of families waits beside loaded carts. They are weary, uncertain. Children clutch wool blankets. That year, King Edward I issued the Edict of Expulsion. All Jews in England were ordered to leave, no exceptions. It was not the first such expulsion, and would not be the last. France expelled its Jewish population several times between the 12th and 14th centuries. But amidst these bleak edicts, we find resilience. Jewish communities did not vanish without leaving a trace, and more importantly, they did not abandon their sense of self. Resistance came not through arms, but through ritual. Consider the act of lighting candles on the Sabbath. It is a small gesture done at twilight, quietly, within the home. In this act, identity is preserved, even in secret, even in exile. Or the preparation of matzah during Passover, carefully baked, without leaven, according to ancient instruction. Even naming practices carried resistance. A child named Eleazar God has helped. Born in a time of flight, there is also the resistance of memory. When communities were uprooted, they carried with them not only possessions, but stories. And from them, new communities were born. Jews expelled from France found new homes in Provence. Those cast out from England settled in the Rhineland. Here again we see how culture adapts. In the face of elite rejection, Jewish life did not break. It bent, reformed, adapted, continued, not in palaces, but in kitchens. There are records of rabbis rewriting liturgy in exile, of teachers holding classes in hidden rooms. And then there is art, though rarely preserved. Medieval Jewish art, especially illuminated manuscripts, offers glimpses of beauty amid restriction. That, too, is resistance. As we listen to the slow turning of these pages, we hear the voice of a people refusing to disappear. We return now to our imaginary street, the one we've walked before. It is late evening. A Christian priest returns to his rectory. Let us rest here a moment. Let us feel the weight of endurance. In the next and final part of this segment, we will examine how the concept of difference was used by elite society not only to define Jews, but to define themselves, and how this mirror continues to reflect even now. The invented mirror. How medieval elites defined themselves by defining the other. Let us sit for a moment longer. At the edge of the medieval world, the sun has dipped behind a stone horizon. The sound of bells has faded. The hearth crackles softly, and into this calm dusk, we introduce the final theme of this long journey. Not simply how Jewish people were seen, how difference was used not only to oppress, but to reinforce the fragile structures of power, theology, and self-understanding, and how, in doing so, a distorted mirror was created. And along the entryway, carved in high relief, are two female figures, ecclesia and synagoga. One stands proud, crowned, eyes wide open. The other, blindfolded, her scepter fallen, her tablets slipping from her hand. A once sacred path that had, in their eyes, come to an end with the crucifixion of Christ. The Jewish people, then, were cast not just as outsiders, but as obstinate witnesses, forever present, yet never included, punished not for their sins, but for their refusal to convert. A reflection that said more about the gazer than the subject. In art, he was drawn with exaggerated features, pointed hats, hooked noses, twisted expressions. In plays, he was mocked, cast as a villain, a deceiver, a sorcerer, or treated, or governed but how they were imagined. In this final part, we explore how elite medieval society constructed its identity in contrast to the Jew. It was no longer simply that some Jewish leaders had rejected Jesus in the first century. Now, it was that all Jews, forever, carried that guilt. That betrayal was not an act, but an essence. It was never truly about Jews. This is proof of our truth. St. Augustine famously argued that Jews should not be destroyed, but preserved like Cain, marked and wandering to remind Christians of sin and redemption. Imagine a cathedral, vast and echoing, in the heart of a great medieval city. This was not a description, it was a performance. Its stone arches reach heavenward. Its stained glass windows catch the light in hues of crimson and gold. These statues were not merely decorative, they were theological arguments rendered in stone. They told the viewer, this is the true faith and this is the one that refused to see. Rumors spread, accusations followed. Local Jews were blamed falsely, grotesquely, of murdering the boy in a mock crucifixion. There was no evidence, but the story stuck. In the minds of medieval elites, bishops, theologians, King's Judaism represented not simply a different religion, but a rejected one. Each time, the narrative followed a pattern. A missing child, a grieving town, a panicked accusation. Each time, the details were more embellished. Each time, the consequences were more dire. And so, paradoxically, Jews were both necessary and despised. Necessary because their continued existence validated Christian doctrine. See, the theologians might say, they walk among us, wandering, blind. The narrative claimed that, when pierced, these wafers bled. Again, there was no evidence. But trials were held. Torture was used. Executions followed, yet they were despised because their presence complicated things. It suggested that belief was not universal, that dissent was possible, that the truth might look different through another lens. If the Jew could harm Christ again this time in symbolic form, then vigilance was required. Unity demanded exclusion, a need to reinforce the lines between us and them. The use of Hebrew, the covering of mirrors, the tearing of garments, these rituals felt strange, even menacing to outsiders. Songs sung in minor keys, the blowing of the shofar, the lighting of candles all became fodder for suspicion. To resolve this contradiction, the elite imagination created a version of the Jew that bore little resemblance to actual Jewish people. In sermons, the Jew was portrayed as greedy, counting coins, hoarding wealth. And in doctrine, he became the eternal betrayer. If the Jew was cast as obsessed with law, then the Christian could be gracious. If the Jew was cast as rigid, the Christian could be merciful. If the Jew was cast as faithless, then the church stood firm in belief. This notion that Jews had betrayed Jesus was not invented in the Middle Ages, but it took new and dangerous shape there. A candle flickers beside a stack of correspondence letters from communities in Iberia, in North Africa, in Italy. about how to resolve a question of inheritance fairly, about the meaning of a particular verse, about how to lead a community with wisdom. The rabbi pauses, dips his quill, and begins to write. Lives of rhythm, of ritual, of quiet endurance. This idea filtered into law, art, ritual, and daily life. And yet, it was about control. Control over faith, control over memory, control over the boundaries of belonging. Their lives were not oppositional, they were parallel. Their culture, no less rich. Their prayers, no less deep. How power defines itself through the definition of others. How the mirror, once cracked, continues to distort. By defining the Jew as the other-blind, obstinate, materialistic, the Christian elite defined themselves as the opposite, enlightened, obedient, spiritual. Let the echoes of thrones and sermons fade. Let the stories we've uncovered rest beside you. And like all performances, it required props. Consider the blood libel, or linger a little longer. In the hush of understanding, in 1144, in Norwich, England, a young boy named William was found dead. Over the next centuries, similar accusations emerged in Lincoln, Trent, Blois, and elsewhere. These stories were not rooted in truth. They were rooted in need. A need for scapegoats, a need for meaning in chaos. And the elite supported these tales not because they believed them necessarily, but because they served a purpose. They redirected fear. They preserved authority. They distracted from the injustices within Christian society by projecting them outward. The pattern repeated in another myth, the desecration of the host. In many towns, Jews were accused of stealing and harming consecrated wafer symbols of the body of Christ. The Church, which had long taught the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, found in these stories both threat and confirmation. But not all stories were invented. Some were simply misunderstood. Jewish mourning practices, for example, were often seen by Christian neighbors as secretive or excessive. But each of these was an act of devotion, not defiance. Each was a way to hold on. The elite, unwilling to see this, turned ritual into threat. And in doing so, they created distance, not just social, but symbolic. For medieval Christian elites, Jewish difference became a canvas, a way to paint their own virtues. But these contrasts were illusions. In truth, Jewish communities valued compassion, joy, learning, and faith no less than their neighbors. Let us step now into the study of a rabbi in 14th century Provence. The shelves are lined with manuscripts, psalms, Talmud, legal texts. He writes not about fear, not about accusations. He writes about the law, about ethics. This is what was missed. While elites argued about theology and built statues of division, Jewish scholars and families were building lives. Even when cast as villains in someone else's narrative, they kept writing their own. In this final reflection of Segment 4, we see how the past is shaped not just by actions, but by imagination. But we also see something else. That through it, all accusation, distortion, exile, and myth Jewish life continued. Not untouched, not unaffected, but unbroken. And so we leave this segment not in a palace or pulpit, but in a quiet home. A table is set. The candles are lit, bread is blessed. A prayer is whispered. A child listens. A page turns. The mirror may distort, but behind it, the life it reflects remains dignified, warm, enduring. Now, as we prepare to enter the final closing reflections of this journey, let your breath slow again. You've walked a long path through centuries. Now you may close your eyes, enduring myths, shifting narratives, power, memory, and the question of betrayal, the story beneath the story. How medieval narratives framed the Jewish betrayal. The room is quiet now. The night has settled in. You've traveled far through the narrow lanes of medieval cities, wandered past the archways of cathedrals, stood in the shadows of market stalls and council halls. But now, at last, we come to the deepest, and perhaps the most difficult layer of all. The story beneath the story. In this final exploration, we gently unfold the origin and evolution of a particular historical narrative. The charge of betrayal, the notion that the Jewish people collectively and across all time were responsible for the betrayal and death of Jesus of Nazareth. Yet for over a millennium, it shaped the way Christian societies viewed their Jewish neighbors. It colored theology, justified law, and sanctioned violence. It is a word that echoes across centuries, spoken in sermons, inscribed in chronicles, whispered in suspicion. And how did it persist? It is not an easy idea to hold, nor one based on consistent historical foundation. But where did it begin? Let us walk together, not with judgment, but with curiosity, through the layers of history that gave rise to this enduring myth. The early Christian community was still deeply connected to Judaism. Jesus himself was Jewish. His followers were Jewish. His teachings emerged from Jewish thought and tradition. The division we now perceive had not yet hardened. These were theological arguments, tended to prove Christianity's validity, but they carried historical consequences. And what had been theological disagreement took on the shape of historical accusation. Augustine's position was in some ways protective. He argued that Jews should be spared so they could serve as living witnesses to Christian truth. But this too created a dangerous frame. But in the medieval world, it took on new form, more rigid, more literal, more entwined with law and life. In these texts, Jewish authorities, especially the Pharisees and high priests, are depicted as opponents of Jesus. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE by the Romans marked a seismic shift. Judaism was reeling. Christianity was growing. Each group began to define itself more and more, in contrast to the other. In some passages, the crowd demands his death, and one disciple, Judas Iscariot, delivers him to Roman hands. The topic is the error of the Jews. The room is still, the candles flicker, but the words are sharp. On the walls are painted scenes from the Passion, the trial of Jesus, the mocking, the crown of thorns. The faces of his accusers are drawn with dark features, hooked noses, harsh expressions. The intention is not realism, it is symbolism. It showed up in plays performed in town squares where the Jewish villains sneered and schemed. It appeared in woodcuts and manuscript marginalia. It was passed from parent to child, woven into nursery tales, echoed in jokes. The other must be seen as clearly not us. We begin, as always, with the text. The betrayal by Judas, whose name was often tied to Judah or Jew, became not a singular act, but a communal sin. By teaching that Jews had rejected the truth, the clergy justified its own authority to interpret that truth. The betrayal myth was not just theological, it was institutional, a way to protect hierarchy, to validate control, to draw the boundary between insider and outsider. In times of uncertainty, plague, famine, war societies look for explanation. For a scapegoat, they did not see themselves as betrayers. They saw themselves as wounded, waiting, enduring, that plead with God, not for vengeance, but for restoration. These were not political statements. They were inner reckonings, a way to carry memory with dignity, even when surrounded by misrepresentation. Read or heard tales of betrayal and guilt, he does not question them. They are part of the world he knows. The betrayal story offered a simple one. Suffering was punishment for tolerating those who had once betrayed the Savior. He watches his son study Torah. He watches his daughter light candles on Friday night, and he waits for the day when misunderstanding will ease, the other formed by centuries of ritual, community, and survival. The crucifixion was retold each year in Holy Week, often accompanied by processions, pageants, and sometimes public anger. The New Testament Gospels, written between roughly 70 and 100 CE, tell the story of Jesus' ministry, trial, and crucifixion. But the context of these writings matters. Their response was more subtle. It came through prayer, through legal commentary. The image of the traitorous Jew persisted in books and churches. But to hold it gently, to trace the shapes it left behind, to see the people beneath the symbols, the lives beneath the stories, the connection between Judas and Judaism, though never inherent, had become assumed through poetry. Cathedral schools taught clerics not only theology, but polemics, arguments against Judaism intended to arm future priests with rhetoric to defend the faith. As decades passed, however, and Christianity began to grow beyond its Jewish roots, especially among Gentiles, tensions rose, and in this contrast began the shaping of memory. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, church fathers such as Justin Martyr and Tertullian were already writing about Jewish blindness to the truth and their supposed role in rejecting Jesus. The idea that Jewish people betrayed Jesus' belief once so deeply embedded in law, theology, and common thought that it shaped centuries of exclusion, violence, and exile. As Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, what had been debate became doctrine. By the time of Augustine in the 4th and early 5th centuries, Jews were seen not simply as deniers of Christ, but as the people who had once known God and had turned away. It positioned Jewish survival not as a right, but as a function of Christian belief. This theological foundation was laid long before the Middle Ages began. They study language, philosophy, science. Among them are Christians who read the Old Testament in its original Hebrew for the first time, their eyes opened to a complexity they had long been taught to fear. Let us now walk, very slowly, into the stone nave of a church in 12th century France. The air is cold, the light dim. Some writers even if cautiously begin to see Jewish thought not only as ancient but as rich, as rational, as deeply spiritual. Into the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment, sermons delivered from pulpits echoed these images. By the 13th century, this narrative became embedded in education. He is careful, respectful, but firm. His voice is not of accusation, but of inclusion. He speaks not of betrayal, but of humanity. Imagine yourself sitting in one of these schools. The students wear woolen robes, ink-stained fingers grip quills. A master reads from a text, Peter the Venerable, or perhaps Thomas Aquinas. Reason becomes the guiding light. Old dogmas are re-examined. The idea of religious toleration gains ground first as a political necessity, later as a moral argument. In others, they are granted partial emancipation allowed to work, but not vote, to trade, but not teach. The suspicion remains. The old stories echo. The myth of betrayal, though quieter, has not vanished. These teachings filtered downward. They ask whether the accusations of betrayal, so long echoed in churches and courts, are based not in evidence, but in emotion. Nationalism seeks unity through blood, through land, through history. And once again, the Jew is cast as other. By the later Middle Ages, the idea of betrayal was no longer debated, was assumed. But all of this raises a question. Why did the betrayal narrative remain so powerful for so long? Part of the answer lies in psychology. The Jewish moneylender becomes the Jewish banker. The old charge of usury becomes the new fear of conspiracy. The betrayal of Christ becomes the betrayal of culture. But another answer lies in politics. By reinforcing Jewish guilt, the church reinforced Christian virtue. The economy is shifting. Borders are uncertain. Politicians speak of purity, of loyalty, of enemies within. It was built upon centuries of suspicion, shaped by theology, reinforced by law, and repeated through myth. The idea of betrayal, so softly sown in medieval sermons, bore a bitter fruit. Let us now pause and turn to the Jewish side of this story. How did Jewish communities respond to the charge of betrayal? Not with denial, for often they were not even allowed to speak publicly in defense. Not with counter-accusation, for they lacked the power. They look upon centuries of prejudice, and they ask, what was true and what was constructed? There are medieval Hebrew poems that speak of pain, not just physical, but spiritual, that ask why exile endures, that the crucifixion cannot be used to justify hatred, that the bond between Christianity and Judaism is profound and ancient. Something begins to change. In Spain, before the expulsions, Jewish poets such as Judah, Halavi, and Solomon, Ibn Gabriel, wrote of longing for Jerusalem, of sorrow for the lost temple. This disconnect between what was said about them and what they felt within created a silent chasm. Now imagine a Christian peasant in the 14th century. He has never met a Jewish person, but he has heard sermons, seen passion plays, and now imagine a Jewish merchant in the same town he keeps to his quarter, pays his taxes, speaks politely. He knows how he is shone but says nothing. This is the quiet reality behind the loud myth. New scholarship arises, new voices. Jewish historians study not only persecution, but poetry, music, law, joy to lives, side by side, one formed by stories passed down from authority. As we approach the end of this long part of Segment 5, let us consider one final thread: the persistence of symbols. Even after expulsions, even after persecution, the myth of betrayal remained in the art and memory of Christian Europe. But it is not permanent. Stories can be re-examined. Myths can be dismantled. History, when studied calmly, has the power to clear the fog. And so we sit here in this quiet space, looking not to condemn, but to understand, not to rewrite the past. We have one part remaining in this segment. In it, we will examine how the modern era began to unravel these old narratives, and how memory, if treated carefully, can become a place of healing. But for now, let the silence rest, let the candles burn low, let the echo of the past soften. You are safe in this stillness. Remembering without blame, unraveling the myth in the light of modern thought, the candles burn lower now. We return, softly, to the myth we have followed like a shadow. And now, we watch, quietly, as that idea begins to loosen. As the world turns, ever so gradually, toward a different way of remembering. Let us begin this final segment, not in the medieval world, but on its edge. In the early Renaissance, the 15th century, here in the corners of Florence, Toledo, and Mainz, scholars are rediscovering old manuscripts, Greek, Latin, Hebrew. The humanist movement begins to question the rigid binaries that medieval scholasticism had built. A Jewish mother rocks her child to sleep with a lullaby in Ladino. In another, a Christian monk kneels in prayer, unaware of the myths his brethren have carried. Within its light, still, myths endure. But the door has opened. Now we move gently forward. Here, in salons and lecture halls, philosophers begin to challenge the inherited beliefs of the past. In this climate, some Christian thinkers begin to critique the narrative of collective Jewish guilt, but with the stillness of a shared past. But with calm, the questions are quiet at first, but they are steady with truth. With the quiet rhythm of understanding, in 1749, the German thinker Moses Mendelssohn, Jewish philosopher, living in a Christian society, writes of reason, ethics, and coexistence. This is how the story begins to shift, not in protest, but in reasoned reply. Still, the shadow of the medieval past lingers. In some places, Jews are still confined to ghettos. And then, the 19th century arrives with its revolutions, its nationalism, its longing for identity. Here, a new danger arises. As old religious authority wanes in parts of Europe, new political ideologies emerge, no longer solely as betrayer of Christ, but now as betrayer of the nation. This is a chilling transformation, from theological accusation to political scapegoating. Let us walk now through the streets of Vienna in the 1890s. The buildings are tall, elegant. The city buzzes with art, music, literature, but beneath it flows a current of anxiety. And in this climate, old myths find new language. Pamphlets are printed, cartoons drawn. It is no longer the medieval myth, but its descendant. And so we step slowly into the 20th century. A time that would bring unthinkable suffering. In Germany, in Poland, across Europe, the Holocaust, though modern in method, was not created in a vacuum. 6 million Jews were killed. The silence of the world, in many cases, was not the silence of ignorance, but of apathy. But here, in the years after the war, a reckoning unfolds. Christian theologians, especially within the Catholic Church, begin to examine their own history. They study the teachings of the past. They read the early Church Fathers. In 1965, the Second Vatican Council issues Nostra Aetate Declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions. In it, for the first time in official Catholic doctrine, the Church declares that Jews as a people cannot be blamed for the death of Jesus. This moment is quiet, gentle, without spectacle. But it is historic, a turning of the tide. Not the erasure of the past, but a recognition of it. Other Christian denominations begin similar reflections. Dialogue increases. Jewish-Christian relations shift slowly, carefully from accusation to understanding. And in Jewish communities, too, memory is reshaped. The trauma of centuries remains, but it is no longer only suffering. It becomes a source of identity, of resilience. In classrooms and synagogues, children are taught not only what was lost, but what was preserved. And so the myth of betrayal begins to lose its power. It does not disappear. In some corners, it still lingers echoing faintly in rhetoric, in rumor. But it is no longer the defining lens. Now we see complexity. We see that Jesus was Jewish, that his teachings were born of Jewish tradition, that the conflicts of the first century were political, theological, human, not eternal. We see that Judas was one man, not a symbol, that blame is not hereditary, that suffering cannot be explained by myth. And so we arrive, gently, at a new kind of history, a history that listens, that pauses, that holds silence as sacred. Now, let us return one final time to the medieval street we have so often imagined. It is night. The stars hang above like quiet candles. The city sleeps. In one home, neither one knows the fullness of the story we now hold, but both live within its shadow, and both, for if history has taught us anything, it is that stories shape the world, but stories can also be rewritten with care. And so we end this segment, and this long journey, not with blame, but with reflection, not with judgment, not with division. Let the myths dissolve like mist. Let memory remain. Let your breath be slow, and your rest be deep. Traces beneath the stones, lost documents, folklore, and the spaces where histories touch hidden archives, buried testimonies, echoes of Jewish life in the margins of the medieval world. Imagine. You are standing in the damp stillness of a medieval library. The shelves are carved from dark wood. The windows are narrow, set deep in stone. Outside, the rain taps softly against glass, but inside, the silence is thicker than air. You can smell parchment aged, dry, slightly musty. Somewhere behind you, a candle flickers. On the table before you lies a manuscript. Its cover is cracked, its pages faded, and yet, what it contains may be one of the only surviving records of an event that happened 700 years ago. A name mentioned once, a phrase half crossed out, a record of a tax, a debt, a marriage contract, a dispute. But if we lean in close, if we read the margins, the fragments, the hidden files, we can begin to hear another voice. And maybe, in the margins, a note tune, not by the scribe, but by the hand of someone unseen. Because these writings often contained the name of God, they could not be thrown away. And so, they were stored quietly, respectfully. This is where segment 6 begins, not in palaces or cathedrals, but in archives, in forgotten folios, in the layered, overlooked places where real lives left faint traces, not only religious texts, but shopping lists, letters, contracts, poems, medical prescriptions, even jokes. For centuries, the stories of medieval Jewish communities were shaped not by their own hands, but by those outside them: priests, kings, chroniclers, inquisitors. The language is precise, courteous, the terms of trade are set. There is no hint of suspicion, only shared economy. Let us begin in Genesa. Aaron, son of Ilias, Miriam, the widow, Jacob the dyer, these were not only names, they were identities. Some appear again and again across years, marking continuity in a time of instability. A Genesa is a storage space, often a hidden attic or chamber within a synagogue where Jews placed worn-out religious texts. The most famous Genesa in the world is the Cairo Genesa. Discovered in the late 19th century in the Ben Ezra Synagogue of Old Cairo, this archive contained over 300,000 fragments of manuscripts. What emerged was astonishing. Mikvehs, schools, homes, community buildings, all preserved beneath centuries of soil and stone. These documents, many from the 10th to 13th centuries, offer an unparalleled window into Jewish life across the Mediterranean. And through them, we glimpse the quiet rhythms of daily life. A mother writing to her son abroad, a merchant tallying silk and dye. These remains, some dating to the 11th century, confirmed what had long been recorded but seldom visualized. Gold coins, jewelry, silver brooches, a wedding ring inscribed in Hebrew. It had been hidden by a family fleeing violence, never to return. That Jewish life in medieval Europe was not marginal, not transitory, but rooted, built, complex. A scribe lamenting a broken pen, of half-remembered legends, of tales told by hearthlight. Here, we see what is rarely preserved. Not the dramatic moments, but the mundane. Stories of wandering wise men, of righteous strangers, of golems and angels. No one knows who they are. They do not know it themselves, but they exist in every generation. It was an inward assurance, a belief that goodness does not always announce itself, that righteousness can live hidden, quietly, humbly, holding the balance between mercy and judgment. They were not always set in real cities or anchored in real time, but they carried real emotion. In the scraps of worn parchment, the past breathes not as myth, but as lived experience. Elsewhere, archives tell different stories. The melody carries across time, across borders, across trauma. In the folklore of Provence and Catalonia, there are tales of Jewish doctors whose cures could not be matched. In many places, these names remained long after the people were gone. These stories are not history, but they reflect memory. Sometimes fearful, sometimes admiring, always ambiguous. Jewish communities still left marks, marks that outlasted the myths that sought to contain them. Another layer always existed, a quieter one, a more truthful one, preserved not in crowns or sermons, but in pages tucked into walls, in rings buried for safekeeping, in lullabies remembered by heart. In southern France, in the town of Arles, a 13th century notary's book contains an agreement between a Christian merchant and a Jewish physician. In England, tax rolls from the 1200s list Jewish names beside Christian ones, but the stories these documents tell are rarely whole. And so the work of the modern historian becomes like that of an archaeologist sifting, connecting, reconstructing. Speaking of archaeology, let us turn now to the ground. Beneath modern cities, beneath cobbled streets and office buildings, remnants of medieval Jewish life lie hidden. In 2001, workers digging a parking garage in Cologne, Germany, uncovered the foundations of a medieval Jewish quarter. This wasn't just a discovery of architecture, it was a rediscovery of presence. But for its fullness, Cologne had one of the oldest documented Jewish communities in Northern Europe, and the steady hands of artists and curators who dared to do what the past once tried to prevent. Further east, in the city of Erfurt, Germany, archaeologists unearthed a treasure buried during a 14th century pogrom. This treasure does not tell of betrayal. It tells of fear and love and hope and silence. Each artifact recovered, each shard, each script, each bonus a whisper from the past. Not loud, not authoritative, but real, but a quiet place. Perhaps it's in an old building, once a synagogue, now transformed into a space of learning and reflection. The walls whisper, not shout. And in each case lies an item that once belonged to someone whose name we may never know, but they are treasures nonetheless, because they are fragments of a world that endured behind walls, inside alleys, in defiance of distortion. And then there is folklore. But alongside the physical discovery came something even more significant, a choice by the city to preserve and present what was found not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a reintroduction of a long-erased identity. Let us now drift gently into the world of stories passed by word of mouth. In Jewish communities, many medieval tales carried coded meanings. One legend, passed down in medieval Ashkenazi communities, speaks of the Lamed Vavniks, the 36, hidden righteous people whose existence sustains the world. Wall panels invite the visitor to consider how we know what we know. After the Holocaust, it stood largely empty, abandoned, ghost-like. But in recent decades, Kazimierz has seen a remarkable restoration, not just of buildings, but of memory. The exhibitions ask questions rather than simply give answers. They allow for silence, for reflection, for care. This tale was not a rebuttal to Christian narratives. In Christian folk traditions, too, echoes of Jewish presence remain, though often distorted. In some German towns, local legends tell of Jewish sorcerers, of enchanted coins, of lost texts. Even where real communities vanished, their memory lingered in local place names: Jews, Street, Synagogue Lane, Old Ghetto. And here lies a curious paradox. Erased in law, vilified in doctrine, displaced by force, serve food inspired by Jewish recipes collected from family letters and oral tradition. And all of this is done, often not only by Jewish descendants, but by local non-Jewish residents who feel the weight of the story and their role in preserving it. In the songs of Sephardic Jews exiled from Spain sung in Ladino, centuries later we hear not bitterness, but longing. But now, more and more scholars and institutions are placing it back where it belongs, within the center of the story. And now, as modern scholars transcribe these songs, reassemble these archives, excavate these cellars, and translate these notes, we are reminded that history is not only what is written, it is also what is hidden, what is buried. In recent years, they have been scanned carefully, page by page, and shared online. Scholars around the world now collaborate to piece together lost texts, what is whispered. As we come to the close of part 1 of this final segment, let us remember, the myth of betrayal was loud, official, repeated. But beneath it, in part 2, we will explore how these recovered stories are helping to reshape how the world understands Jewish Christian history, and how the long journey from accusation to acknowledgement is still being written, and one that can be named, examined, and outgrown. But for now, rest in the silence between the pages. Breathe in the dust of the archive, one that served political, theological, and social ends, and one that can be set aside. Let the past remain close but gentle. Let it soothe. Let it settle. They drank from the same wells. Their children learned to speak in the same dialects. And yes, there were walls, legal, social, and spiritual. You are not alone in remembering, reimagining the past. Modern memory, museums, and the soft repair of a broken story, the final traces are not found in stone. She thanks her, praises her gentleness, and wishes her blessings in both languages. They're not buried beneath city streets or pressed between the covers of fading manuscripts. They are found in quieter places in conversations, exhibitions, digital archives, scholarly reflections, to remember Jewish life in Europe not only for its tragedies, to recover voices, to tell stories again gently, patiently, lovingly. As we move into this final part of Segment 6, imagine yourself walking through a modern museum knot, one filled with grandeur. There is glass over the displays. The lighting is soft, a child's slate board etched with Hebrew letters. Survivors' grandchildren teach songs that once echoed in courtyards, now long gone. A wedding contract, decorated in delicate ink. A spice box for Havdalah, its lid slightly dented. A wooden prayer stand, worn smooth by years of use. These are not treasures in the sense of gold or silver. Let us begin here, in Erfurt, Germany. For every myth told, a truth waits in the archive. For every silence imposed, a song endures. You may recall from Part 1 that the city's medieval Jewish quarter was partially uncovered in recent years. Today, the Erfurt Treasure Witch includes over 3,000 silver coins, ceremonial items, and personal belongings as housed with careful interpretation. Not just Jews who were persecuted, but citizens, mothers, scholars, tailors, neighbors. The museum experience avoids sensationalism. It leans into quiet detail. Now let us walk a little farther east, to Poland. In the district of Kazimierz, the narrow streets once held a thriving Jewish community, centuries old. Jewish festivals now take place here annually. Synagogues, once in disrepair, have been gently restored. Cultural centers hold classes in Yiddish and Hebrew. Their work is not about guilt, it is about responsibility. And so Kazimierz has become a kind of living Genizanat, a place where things are buried, but where they are tenderly stored and shared again. Let us now return westward, to France, to Spain, to Italy, in city after city. Quiet efforts are underway to map the invisible in Narbonne. Local historians gather oral histories about forgotten cemeteries. In Girona, archaeologists uncover mikvehs hidden beneath layers of Renaissance flooring. In Bologna, university students help transcribe centuries-old Jewish community records, slowly bringing them into digital light. Each small act adds to a growing mosaic, and this mosaic is not only about Judaism, it is about Europe itself, for too long. The Jewish presence in medieval and early modern Europe was treated as peripheral, mentioned briefly in textbooks, framed around conflict or exclusion, not merely as the other, but as a thread in the fabric. A thread of language, of law, of music, of food, of intellectual exchange. Let us now step into a quiet study room in Oxford. The Bodleian Library holds some of the oldest Hebrew manuscripts in the world. In this work, medieval anti-Jewish polemic is not ignored, but it is reframed. It is not the story, it is part of the story, a layer, a lens. Now, we sit with a new question. What happens when a myth such as the myth of betrayal is acknowledged, dissected, and shown for what it was? Does the story lose power? Or does the silence it leaves behind invite something gentler to enter? This is the quiet revolution underway today. The recognition that the myth of Jewish betrayal was never a historical certainty, but a constructed narrative. In its place comes something deeper. Not the erasure of difference, but the honoring of shared time. Christians and Jews lived in the same cities, traded in the same markets, walked the same cobbled roads. But through cracks in those walls, voices passed, and sometimes even friendships bloomed. In the archives of Marseille, a letter survives from a 14th century Christian woman to her Jewish midwife. In the records of Sicily, a Jewish physician is summoned to the royal court not only for his skill, but because the queen has grown fond of his presence in Catalonia. Troubadour ballads contain snippets of Hebrew phrases suggesting that melodies, at least, knew no border. These are the footnotes of history. But sometimes, the footnotes matter more than the headlines. And as we trace them gently with our eyes, we begin to see that the myth of betrayal was never the full story. It was a story told over other stories. And now, finally, those stories are rising to the surface. We close this segment not with conclusion, but with continuity, for the work of remembering continues. Museums open, new exhibitions, universities host dialogues, artists paint murals over old ghetto walls, not to forget, but to blend memory with beauty. Children walk through once abandoned streets, holding paper lanterns on remembrance nights. And in old buildings repurposed for peace, voices rise in both Hebrew and Latin, not in accusation, but in harmony. History is never quiet, but it can be made gentle. And so you may rest now with this knowledge, that for every page torn, 100 have been saved. Let the candles burn low, let the dust settle, let the stories breathe again. The architecture of separation, borders, symbols, and the quiet enforcement of otherness in the shadow of the wall. How medieval society structured exclusion. Without always saying so, imagine it is early morning in a medieval city. The air is cool, misty. The stone walls of the city are still wet with dew. The cobbled streets are mostly empty, save for a few early risers bakers opening their shutters, a blacksmith tending the dying embers of last night's forge, and a milkmaid walking slowly with her bucket. As you follow the curve of the main street, past wooden signs creaking in the soft wind, you notice something change not in sound, but in feeling. There is a bend in the road where the buildings begin to look a little older, their windows narrower. A high stone wall appears at your left, not tall enough to intimidate, but enough to suggest division. A narrow gate is open, but the archway bears a small symbol etched into the stone, a circle, maybe, or a star. You have entered the Jewish quarter. In most medieval cities, separation was not just physical, it was architectural, spatial, psychological. They were both protective and restrictive, sometimes voluntary, sometimes enforced. It was designed not only through force, but through centuries of habit, regulation, and slow shaping of the landscape. And yet, Jewish life persisted, not in isolation, but within this carefully bounded space. Let us walk through that boundary together, gently here, in the heart of medieval urban planning. Jewish quarters, sometimes called juveries in French, in Spain, or ghettos in later periods, were designated zones of residency. Their walls spoke not in words, but in limits. But what did life look like inside these boundaries? It was neither wholly grim nor romanticized. Let us pause now in the center of a medieval Jewish quarter, perhaps in Toledo, Spain. The sun has risen now, the streets are narrow, shaded. Laundry hangs between buildings. The smell of bread drifts from an oven. Shops line the street. Butcher, baker, bookbinder. Inside the synagogue plain, on the outside, quiet and reverent within children, recite prayers. They collected taxes from within, organized their own charities, schools, and courts. Laws might shift without notice, requiring new taxes, new restrictions, new rules for where to walk, when to trade, or how to respond in court. This is not a place of sadness. It is a place of rhythm, and yet the boundaries remain. The laws governing Jewish life were not always consistent, but they were numerous. The purpose of these laws was not primarily theological. It was social. They served to mark difference, to create a visible sign of otherness. But the separation did not end with clothing. Jews could not own land in many territories. Still, Jewish communities adapted. They formed their own internal governance systems, often with elected leaders, known as parnesim, who dealt with external authorities. This internal autonomy, paradoxically, made it easier for Christian authorities to manage Jewish communities. It allowed for separation without direct supervision. But it also created space for culture, for continuity, for survival. They were to be visible, yet separate, necessary, yet reviled, present, but confined. Now let us pause to reflect on what it meant to live with constant visibility. Imagine walking through a city knowing that your clothing marks you. Imagine knowing that your language, your prayers, your calendar make you stand out. Imagine carrying a badge not as a symbol of choice, but of command. But this made them seem clever, even cunning, in the eyes of the suspicious. This visibility could be dangerous. The physical quarter became the mental boundary. Everything undesirable could be imagined to reside over there. It exposed Jewish people to scorn, to mockery to occasional violence. Children might taunt them. Adults might spit. Let us return now to the idea of architecture not only physical, but legal. In medieval law codes, Jews were described not only as religious outsiders, but as perpetual witnesses. The students repeat in sing-song. The smell of ink, of old books, of damp stone fills the air. According to Augustine's theology, Jews were to be preserved, not protected for their sake, but so that their continued existence would serve as proof of Christian truth. This created a strange status. Jews were not to be converted en masse, nor entirely expelled. This ambiguity permeated every aspect of daily life. Jews could lend money because Christians were forbidden to charge interest. But this made them both useful and resented. Jews could read, write, and translate skills valuable in trade and diplomacy. Jews preserved medical knowledge from Arabic and Greek sources. But when plague arrived, they were blamed for it. The same talents that enabled Jewish communities to thrive made them targets. The wall became symbolic, not just of separation, but of projection. Christian societies placed their fears, uncertainties, and contradictions onto the figure of the Jew. Rest within the rhythm of this world. And yet, the wall also protected when violence erupted, whether from mobs' accusations or misguided zealotha, Jewish quarter could close its gates. It became a refuge, not always strong enough, not always safe, but a place where doors could be barred, families could gather, prayers could be whispered in safety, both barrier and shelter. It is in this space that the richness of Jewish culture continued to develop, not in spite of exclusion, but in dialogue with it. Music evolved in its own melodic modes. Language blended Hebrew, Aramaic, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Yiddish. Cuisine was shaped not only by dietary law, but by adaptation, finding ways to cook with what was permitted and available. Inside the Jewish quarter, the streets hum with motion. Outside, the Christian city breathes in its own rhythms: church bells, market songs, the murmur of Latin prayers. People passed through its gates. Words passed through its spaces. Ideas passed silently beneath the noise of doctrine. Children learned not only sacred texts, but how to navigate a world that both needed and excluded them. Let us imagine a school inside the quarter. The room is narrow, the bench is simple, the teacher, or melamed, holds a wooden pointer and moves slowly through the lines of the Torah. Outside, the world may misunderstand them, but inside, understanding is shared. The agreements were formal, written, signed, sometimes even witnessed by both Jewish and Christian scribes. As we begin to draw part 1 of segment 7 to a close, we return to the streets outside the walls. There was risk in stepping out, but also reward. And with that reward came opportunity for interaction. She is searching for a specific spice, cinnamon, perhaps, or saffron, available only through certain traders. She is greeted by a shopkeeper with a courteous nod, who explains in careful provencal the weight and price. Despite deep social barriers, many Christian nobles and even popes employed Jewish doctors, sometimes secretly. The Christian city continues with its markets, its churches, its guild halls, and festivals. They had access to medical texts from the Islamic world, which preserved and expanded the teachings of Hippocrates, Galen, and others. They combined observation with theory and offered alternatives when traditional remedies failed. Jewish merchants sold cloth, wine, spices, parchment, and books. Christian customers came through the quarter gates, carrying coins, textiles, sometimes just curiosity. Within the walls of the Jewish quarter, the rhythms are different but not isolated. Of monks requesting herbal advice from Jewish apothecaries in Salerno, a center of medieval medicine, Jewish and Christian scholars studied side by side for brief, fragile moments. Trade flows through the gates. Letters are sent and received. Ideas travel, even when bodies cannot. This made Jews not only translators in the linguistic sense, but in the cultural sense as well. Ideas moved, definitions shifted, boundaries blurred, and always, beneath the architecture of separation, life continues. A teacher stands at a wooden lectern, reading from a Hebrew grammar text, trying to understand how the language of the Old Testament truly works. His students are Christian. His interest is intellectual. But behind this curiosity is a human reality. The language being studied is spoken daily by the people across the street. In Toledo, Jewish scholars helped translate entire libraries of Arabic, philosophy into Latin, bridging worlds that otherwise would never meet. We will explore in Part 2 how these invisible boundaries began to crack, how some tried to cross them, others to widen them, and some to fortify them forever. But for now, the tone is warm, direct, human. Let the past speak not in arguments, but in atmosphere. Their names are recorded, their ages similar. A note in the margin of one manuscript suggests they shared a fondness for drawing doodles of animals appear beside their names. Let the quiet streets of the quarter return in your mind. Accepted formally by the church, yet never fully embraced by Christian society. Distrusted by former neighbors, suspected by new ones, a candle flickering, a page turning, a wall, a people marked, but never erased. Cracks in the wall, moments of crossing, curiosity, and human connection. Let the light return slowly. The morning has grown older in our imaginary medieval city. The wall between these two spaces stands still, but look closer. And you may begin to see that the wall, though heavy in stone and law, was never quite complete. In this part of our journey, we explore the cracks, the quiet crossings, the moments where medieval lives, though shaped by division, quietly touched. Let us begin with commerce. Trade was perhaps the most obvious reason for contact between Christian and Jewish communities. There are records from 14th century Provence listing debts owed to Jewish moneylenders by local farmers, knights, and even minor clergy. In the records of Venice, we find Jewish glassblowers and silversmiths renting stalls outside the ghetto during major festivals. We have evidence of musicians playing together, recipes being borrowed, lullabies echoing across the wall in subtly familiar tunes. Let us picture such a moment. A Christian woman, middle-aged, veiled in modest linen, enters the Jewish quarter during daylight. There is no grand friendship here, but there is civility, recognition, eye contact, a transaction and a crossing. Now, let us look beyond the market, into the space of medicine. In medieval Europe, Jewish physicians were widely known for their skill. How the myth of total separation was used in later centuries to justify new exclusions, even as the past was far more complicated. Rest in the quiet truth of the in-between. Why? Because Jewish physicians were often fluent in Arabic and Latin. And so, despite bans, despite suspicion, Christian patients turned to Jewish healers quietly, gratefully. We have records of Christian midwives consulting Jewish women on childbirth techniques. Here again, the wall cracked not from rebellion, but from need. And what about language? The Jewish communities of medieval Europe were multilingual by necessity. Hebrew for prayer, Aramaic for commentary, Latin for contracts. The local dialect for daily life, some served as intermediaries in trade between Muslim and Christian lands. Others became valued scribes in royal courts. In the archives of Sicily, we find bilingual contracts written half in Latin, half in Hebrew. These acts of translation were not only technical, they were acts of bridging, and through them, curiosity often grew. Christian scholars began to read Jewish texts, not always kindly, sometimes to argue bit. The act of reading itself cracked the wall. Let us now step into a university lecture hall in the 13th century. The room is cold, the windows narrow. Understanding a language is the beginning of understanding its speakers. Now, let us go deeper to personal relationships. Friendships across religious lines were rare, and sometimes forbidden. But they happened. In Montpellier, a Christian boy and a Jewish boy are documented attending the same tutor. In Cologne, a letter survives from a Christian merchant to his Jewish business partner, thanking him for his honesty and kindness during a difficult season. These are not fictions. They are tiny, surviving windows into real lives. And sometimes, those connections grew even more complex, especially in the case of conversion. Jews who converted to Christianity often found themselves caught between two worlds, and yet many such converts became bridges not just spiritually, but linguistically and intellectually. Some became scholars, translating Jewish texts for Christian readers. Others became court officials, advisors, informants. Their lives were rarely easy, but they walked sometimes quite literally across the wall. And now, let us pause, because not all crossings were gentle. Some were forced, some were manipulative, some were clothed in the language of salvation, but marked by pain, pressure, and the erosion of community. And yet, even here, the cracks reveal something important that the wall never quite held. For every attempt to seal it, to define them as fully separate from us, there were moments where the human reality slipped through. Shared pain, shared curiosity, Shared song? We have records of Christian servants in Jewish households and Jewish tutors for Christian noble children. Sometimes the church pushed back against these moments, fearing contamination, fearing sympathy, and yet they kept happening, because human beings are porous. We do not stay neatly within the lines drawn for us, and so the wall cracks slowly, softly, and constantly. As we move toward part 3 of this segment, we'll examine how these crossings were remembered or forgotten in later history. But for now, between quarter and cathedral, between synagogue and marketplace, between fear and familiarity, there were hands that reached, voices that spoke, lives that met quietly, despite it all. The wall never quite won. Echoes in stone. Memory, myth, and the unraveling of imaginary walls. The walls still stand, but they are quieter now. The city we once walked through, its winding lanes, its hidden gates, its carved symbols of difference, has grown still. The shutters are drawn, the streets emptied, the lamps glow faintly from upper windows, and the world feels hushed beneath the weight of memory. Instead, we trace their afterlives, the ways in which these barriers, both real and imagined, survived in the collective memory of Europe, often more enduring than any physical boundary. In this final part of segment 7, we no longer trace the walls themselves, and how, even today, we are gently learning to see them for what they truly were: not symbols of permanence, but strategies of control. Let us return to where we began. The idea of a wall. It was surrounded by walls and gates that were locked at night. Jewish residents were confined, catalogued, taxed, and watched. And yet, within that confined space, life continued. In the centuries that followed the medieval period, Jewish quarters were sometimes dismantled, sometimes destroyed, and sometimes frozen, in time turned into ghettos under new names, ruled by new laws. In Venice, the word ghetto was first formalized in 1516. The area chosen had been an iron, foundry ghetto in Venetian dialect. Books were written, children were born. Still, the boundaries were quietly resisted, not with revolt, but with endurance. Songs were composed. The walls did not prevent life, they only tried to contain it. The idea of the ghetto spread in Rome. A papal bull in 1555 created one of the most notorious ghettos in Europe, right in the shadow of the Vatican itself. Synagogues were built to resemble churches. Hebrew merged with German, French, and Italian. Clothing changed. Customs softened. It flooded often. The buildings were overcrowded. Restrictions multiplied. On trades, on movement, on dress. And still, the candles were lit each Friday evening. Still, voices rose in prayer by the 18th and 19th centuries. As Enlightenment ideas spread, many European states began to emancipate Jews, allowing for citizenship, removing the requirement of living in confined areas, granting freedom of trade and movement. And it is here that the medieval architecture of exclusion became something more dangerous. The foundation for modern anti-Semitism. These accusations were brutal, but religious in origin. They framed Jews as spiritually dangerous, not biologically different. The walls came down, literally and symbolically. In Vienna, in Paris, in Berlin, Jewish families moved into broader society. Some became lawyers, professors, composers, bankers, writers. To some, it felt like a new beginning. But memory does not always vanish with walls. Even as legal barriers fell, cultural ones lingered. Myths remained, particularly the myth of betrayal. Let us walk slowly through this shift. In the Middle Ages, Jews were often accused of crimes rooted in theology, blasphemy, heresy, betrayal of Christ, desecration of the host. But in the 19th century, a new myth took root. It said that Jews were not only different in belief, but in essence, in blood, in race. The trial exposed deep veins of anti-Semitism, not from kings or bishops, but from journalists, professors, neighbors. This was not theology. It was pseudoscience. But when economic hardship hit, old myths were revived, dressed in modern language, a whisper that Jews were foreign, disloyal, conspiring. It took the invisible wall and placed it in the body. And so, the architecture of separation shifted again. Not through forced quarters, but through ideology. Not symbolic anymore, but real, lethal. Engineered to erase. Through stereotypes passed in newspapers, in classrooms, in laws written with smiling faces and sharp pens. The wall re-emerged more subtle, but no less harmful. In France, during the Dreyfus Affair, a Jewish army officer was wrongly accused of treason. Bronze plaques shine on sidewalks. Old Jewish streets are renamed, restored, remembered. In Germany, in the early 20th century, Jews had achieved high levels of integration. A plaque sits by the entrance not, dramatic, just honest. The myth of betrayal returned not as a medieval passion play, but as propaganda. And then came catastrophe. In the Holocaust, the old wall was rebuilt with terrifying efficiency through ghettos, through transports, through camps. The Jewish cemetery remains as it was, layered, tilted, quiet, and yet, even in the darkest moments, something older survived. The spirit that endured in the medieval quarter, the rhythm of life in narrow streets. The stories passed in whispers, the ability to find meaning even when marked remained, and in the decades after survivors rebuilt, the walls, this time, were not rebuilt. Instead, museums rose. Archives reopened. Memory became the new architecture. One asks a question about the symbols on a synagogue wall. Another notices a name on a gravestone in the village nearby. Let us return gently to the 21st century. In cities across Europe, markers now trace where ghettos once stood. In Barcelona, you can walk through the Call, the medieval Jewish quarter, and see fragments of Hebrew inscriptions carved into stones reused in later buildings. Is the first crack in any wall? In York, England, a quiet garden commemorates the massacre of 1190, where Jews were killed in Clifford's Tower. In Paris, the Marais district holds echoes of Jewish life shops, synagogues, schools layered beneath centuries of change. And in Prague, the Old New Synagogue still holds services. Each of these places is a crack in the old wall space where memory replaces myth and presence replaces accusation. But the process is not complete, for myths do not die easily, they reshape, re-emerge. Even today, echoes of the medieval architecture of exclusion remain in suspicion, in rumor, in old accusations retold with new faces. And so, the work of memory continues. Not loudly, not always with triumph, but gently, with care. Let us imagine now a final scene, a small classroom, somewhere in Europe. A teacher reads aloud a passage from a medieval Jewish text translated carefully into the local language. The students listen. They do not know the full story, but they are curious, and curiosity. And you, listening now, in this moment of rest, are part of that quiet remembering. Because to hear the stories of separation and endurance, of exclusion and survival, is to carry them forward, not with fear, but with softness. And perhaps, in hearing them, we build something new. Not walls, but bridges. Not myths, but memory. Not division, but quiet understanding. Let the final notes of this segment settle in your breath. Let the rhythm of forgotten streets return once more. Let the lights of a distant window, the window of a house within a quarter on a street, without a name flicker softly in your mind, and let it fade. Because history, at its gentlest, does not demand that we stay awake. It simply asks that we remember, kindly. Reflections from the top. Power, prestige, and the Christian elite's need for a Jewish scapegoat, thrones, and pulpits. How elites sustained the myth to protect their power. Imagine yourself standing beneath the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. The stone arches stretch upward, impossibly high. The air is cool, still. Somewhere above, a shaft of light breaks through a narrow stained glass window, casting colored beams onto the marble floor. In the front, a man in ornate robes sits not in prayer, but in judgment. He is not a soldier, not a tradesman, not a monk in silent contemplation. He is a bishop, a knight with coin, land, and people under his care. Or perhaps a chancellor from the royal court, his ink-stained fingers gripping scrolls of law and tax. A prince of the church, and beside him perhaps, physically lower, perhaps metaphorically, so sits a nobleman, a local lord. In this space, decisions are made not just about faith, but about power. And in these quiet chambers, stories are chosen. In the medieval world, the Christian elite kings, popes, bishops, and noble families faced constant challenges to their authority. Famine, war, unrest, plague, heresy, and always the need to keep order to sustain legitimacy, to explain misfortune. And so, from these high places, a story was told that the Jews, those small communities behind walls and laws, were not just different, not just stubborn, in belief, but dangerous, spiritually, socially, even politically. They had, the story went, betrayed the Christ. The Jewish communities of southern France were protected by charters and had survived earlier pogroms through a careful balance of tribute and tolerance. Accusations were made, not from personal encounters, but from the pulpit. Scribes copied sermons that warned of conspiracies, Jews desecrating the host, poisoning wells, aligning with heretics, and thus they stood eternally outside grace. And perhaps, if misfortunes followed, it was not because of poor governance or greed or failed harvests, but because these people still walked among the faithful. This narrative, ancient, painful, and false, did not emerge from the streets. It came from above. Let us begin in the papal courts of Avignon in the 14th century. And more than that, they could seize Jewish property, cancel debts, and present themselves as defenders of Christendom. Here, during the Babylonian captivity of the Church, when the papacy was relocated from Rome to southern France, the Catholic hierarchy faced political tension, loss of spiritual authority, and increasing criticism. But as tensions grew, and as the Church felt increasingly vulnerable, rhetoric against Jews intensified. They are plotting something, not because Jews had changed, but because the Church needed control. Preachers were sent out to speak in town squares, and behind the words is an unspoken understanding. Blame them, and we are safe. Blame them, and we are united. Blame them, and I remain in power. And all of it served a function: to reassert the power of the Church by inventing a spiritual enemy. Across the Alps, in the German-speaking territories, local princes also found this myth convenient. When debts ran high, when peasant discontent threatened revolt, when famine turned public mood, bitter there was a solution close at hand: blame the Jews. By spreading rumors that Jews killed Christian children or desecrated sacred items, nobles could redirect public fury. Let us pause now in the castle hall of a minor noble, perhaps in Saxony. He has heard rumors from another town. A child has died under mysterious circumstances. His advisor leans in. It was the Jews, he whispers. Does the noble believe it, perhaps? Or perhaps he sees an opportunity. He calls for an inquiry. He gathers the town's Christians into the square. He speaks in solemn tones. Her staff is broken, her head turned away, her crown fallen. Nearby stands Ecclesia, radiant, triumphant, clear-eyed. This was not a unique moment. It was a pattern, and those who adhered to it were not merely mistaken but dangerous. From England, where King Edward I expelled the Jews in 1290, partly to cancel debts owed to Jewish financiers, to France, where Philip IV did the same, and then invited them back when it suited his treasury, always in scenes of accusation. At the trial of Jesus, in the court of Pilate, standing in the crowd shouting for crucifixion, to Castile and Aragon, where monarchs vacillated between protection and persecution, depending on politics, they were endorsed by the most powerful institutions in the medieval world. The Jewish community became a tool in elite hands, a lever, a scapegoat, a symbol. The myth of betrayal was not perpetuated out of ignorance. It was maintained, nurtured, and reshaped because it worked. It simplified the world and still feels superior to the Jew, who is allowed to live only on sufferance. It removed complexity. It justified harsh measures. It painted enemies in clear lines. Now, let us enter a cathedral again, this time in Cologne, or perhaps Trier, or Canterbury, traced back to that single dangerous myth. High above the altar, a stone carving depicts a blindfolded woman, synagoga, the personification of Judaism. These sculptures were not accidents, they were statements, placed high on sacred walls to teach through stone. To teach that Judaism was not only obsolete, but wrong, and thus the myth of betrayal moved not only through law and sermon, but through art, carefully, through stained glass, through altar paintings, through illuminated manuscripts. Children grew up seeing Jews depicted with hooked noses, dark robes, pointed hats, and these images were not neutral. Over time, this shaped a worldview in which the elite could continue to rule unjustly. It always finds someone beneath them to blame, a worldview in which the ordinary Christian peasant could suffer under taxes, labor, and war. And even unlikely voices began to challenge the architecture of power and its dependence on exclusion. A worldview in which every Good Friday reminded believers not only of the passion of Christ, but of the so-called treachery of those who did not believe. It was a cycle, and the higher up you went in the social hierarchy, the more carefully it was managed. In universities, scholars penned treatises against the stubbornness of the Jews. In royal courts, advisors whispered of plots and secret alliances. In council meetings, bishops passed laws about where Jews could live, what they could wear, when they could speak. But not every monarch, bishop, or court intellectual moved with such certainty. For even within structures built upon myth, cracks sometimes formed. Unlike many rulers of his time, Pedro was known for protecting his Jewish subjects. He appointed Samuel Halavi as his treasurer learned, Jewish official, whose name and dignity still echo through the halls of the synagogue of El in Toledo. Each layer added a stone to the wall. The air is thick with incense, with age, and with the quiet echoes of prayers long since said. We are no longer in the height of medieval certainty. Instead, we drift into the spaces where doubt began to seep in slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Of peace, not one of defense, but of exclusion, and all of it. That betrayal was not an act by a few, but a condition of an entire people, a myth that served the interests of those who ruled by giving them something to control, something to define themselves against, something to offer as explanation for failure. There is a new appetite for reason, for ancient languages, for reinterpreting Scripture. As we begin to close part 1 of this final segment, let us pause on a quiet image. A Christian scribe, late at night, copying a sermon into a manuscript. Johann Reuchlin, a German scholar, defends Hebrew books from arguing, controversially, that Jews should not be silenced, but read. He writes slowly, "The words warn of Jews. They twist Scripture into accusation." And yet, across the city, a Jewish scribe is also writing. He too copies a text, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a memory of exile. Both men are tired, both use the same kind of ink, both listen to the night outside. A Christian monk, elderly stooped, dips his pen into ink and writes a letter. But one writes within safety, and the other behind a wall. As we move to part 2, we will explore how some elites began to question this myth, how humanists, reformers, he does not know what to do with this feeling. He writes, "Though I am not of their people, I hear in their words a sorrow we share. But for now, let the light of the cathedral fade. Let the noise of the court grow quiet. Let the myths unravel slowly in your mind." Some sheltered Jewish neighbors, some hid children, some in the wake of terrible violence, wrote accounts that mourned not triumph, but tragedy, who appealed to their bishops, who locked gates, who risked their lives. And let the silence remind you that all power built on fear must eventually fall. Whispers of doubt. When power meets conscience and the wall trembles, the great cathedral is dark now. Its vast windows reflect no sunlight, only shadows and candlelight. The previous part of our journey followed those in power who used the myth of betrayal to maintain control. Cracks of empathy, of curiosity, of fatigue. In this part, we wander through those rare corridors where the wall began to tremble, not collapse. Not yet, but tremble under the weight of contradiction. Let us begin in the 14th century, in the court of King Pedro I of Castile, also known and usually as Pedro the Just or Pedro the Cruel, depending on who was speaking. Why did Pedro protect the Jews when others did not? Perhaps it was political calculation. Perhaps it was personal loyalty. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was a flicker of human recognition, a realization that the myth of betrayal, the old story, served more the interests of his rivals than any truth. Let us sit in the cloistered quarters of a cardinal who has just returned from a diplomatic mission to the east. There, in the streets of Constantinople, he saw Jews and Christians and Muslims walking side by side. He saw synagogues standing next to mosques. He saw less fear, less suspicion, and for this he was condemned by later chroniclers as too close to Jews, accused of being corrupted, a betrayer himself. And yet, under his reign, Jewish culture in Castile experienced a rare moment of breath, of partial forgetting of the wall. Travel now, gently, to 15th century Italy. The Renaissance is beginning. Humanist scholars pore over classical texts, and with this comes a re-examination of Jewish thought. Pico della Mirandola, a Christian philosopher, reads the Kabbalah and finds, to his astonishment, reflections of Christian truth hidden within it. These men do not reject Christianity. They do not embrace Judaism, but they begin, ever so slightly, to question the ease with which Christian power condemned the other. They suggest very carefully that understanding may be preferable to destruction, and in doing so, they shake the wall. Let us now pause in a quieter room, not a cathedral, not a court, a study. Wooden shelves covered in scrolls, an oil lamp burns low. He has just read a Hebrew poem. He does not understand all of it, but something in its rhythm, in its lamentation, moved him. He signs the letter. It is never sent, but the moment is real. Jewish texts, Christian texts, rebuttals, defenses, commentaries all circulated more widely. These are not acts of revolution. They are not loud nor widespread, but they are interruptions. Interruptions of certainty. Interruptions of myth. Interruptions, too, began to rise from among the people. In certain cities, Christian citizens began to speak out when pogroms were proposed. In Speyer, in Mainz, in Worms, communities of Jews were massacred during the Crusades. But records survive of Christians who tried to stop it. Small gestures, easily forgotten. But when seen together, they reveal something powerful. The myth never fully worked. The architecture of exclusion was never total. Even in the highest towers, the most echoing halls, there were those who whispered, "Is this truly right?" Here, in this damp city of canals and fog, they found uneasy refuge. Now let us consider the role of women in this trembling. While most sermons, laws, and edicts were crafted by men, women who bore the rhythms of daily life often maintained relationships across boundaries. A Christian wet nurse might care for a Jewish infant. A Jewish midwife might attend a Christian mother. Stories passed between them, prayers overheard, jokes shared, and through these small moments, the grand narrative of betrayal softened, not erased, but questioned. Let us return now to the papal palace, but not to its public chambers. And now, back in Rome, he wonders, have we made our wall too high? He dares not speak this aloud, but it settles in his heart. This was not unique, not all at once, not entirely, but enough to allow light in. There were bishops who intervened when violence threatened Jewish quarters. There were nobles who extended protection not from love, but from conscience. There were city councils who, after hearing too many sermons about blood libel, quietly changed the subject. And always, behind the scenes, were voices asking questions. Why do they remain if they are so evil? Why do they pray with such beauty if they are lost? Why do their children look like ours? These were not enlightened questions. They were not free from prejudice, but they were interruptions, and history is built often from interruptions. Now let us gently shift toward the quieter forms of rebellion that came not from above, but from within the system. Monasteries housed monks who copied Hebrew grammar books, not to mock but to learn. Libraries stored Jewish commentaries alongside Greek philosophy, not to condemn but to compare. Artists in Italy painted Jews, not with grotesque features, but as neighbors. Mystics wrote about shared divine light, and in each act something shifted. The wall trembled, and then came printing. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century allowed ideas to spread faster than before, and with them came voices. Voices that said, "These people are not devils. They are scholars. They are poets." Others said, "They are obstinate, but not evil." Still others said, "Perhaps we do not yet understand." And this, too, was dangerous to those who preferred the wall. Because a wall is useful only when its strength is believed. And belief, once cracked, is difficult to restore. Let us end this part not with collapse, but with soft resistance. Picture a Jewish teacher in 16th century Amsterdam reading to a group of students. The Spanish Inquisition had driven many Sephardic Jews north. The teacher speaks of exile, of endurance, of the myth of betrayal. "They told us we were treacherous," he says, "but we remained." He does not speak with hate. He speaks with calm. "They built walls," he says. "We built memory." And the students listen. One writes a poem, one sketches a star. One simply closes his eyes and breathes. This is where the real power lies. Not in law, not in punishment, but in breath, in continuity, in quiet trembling. As we move into part 3, we will examine how the myth of betrayal was slowly unmade. And until then, rest in the stillness of doubt, where power hesitates and truth waits, dismantling shadows. The long unmaking of the myth and the quiet turn toward light, the dawn comes slowly, pale and blue, after the longest of nights. The air is quiet, as if the world holds its breath, waiting. Brick by symbolic brick we trace the unmaking of a powerful narrativa myth that cast its shadow across centuries of Christian thought, politics, and law. We do not seek to vilify, but to understand how belief, fear, and politics combined to sustain a powerful, painful story, and how, in time, people quietly, insistently began to change it. In the soft light that touches the edges of history, we begin to see what has long been hidden. It is not the triumph of truth that greets us first, but the gentle retreat of illusion. But in this landscape, figures such as Baruch Spinoza emerged brilliant, excommunicated, and radical. Spinoza questioned the very foundation of revealed religion. He stood not in open defiance, but in calm refusal. His ideas, heretical to some, became foundational for later philosophy. And in his presence, in his writing, the myth met its first intellectual unmaking. The myth, once towering and absolute, begins to lose its edges. And with it, the scaffolding of falsehood begins to come undone. Cromwell saw utility in Jewish merchants, but also understood the theological implications. Voltaire mocked all religion, including the mythic foundations of Christianity. Anti-Semitism changed shape. It became modern, nationalistic. It was engineered, mapped, tallied. 6 million lives erased, not in mobs or cathedrals, but in camps, trains, gas chambers. Bureaucrats filled out forms. Scientists designed methods. And yet, at the core, it mutates, reemerges, dresses in new robes, but it is no longer sacrosanct. It is named, challenged, confronted. The myth of betrayal remained. The Jew, once cast as Christ killer, was now portrayed as rootless parasite, global manipulator. The justifications were new. You have walked this road through fear and doubt, power and persistence. You have seen how the myth began, how it spread, how it clung to pulpits and laws. And now you have seen how it was and is unmade. The hatred was not, and pseudoscientific, the Jew, declaring that Jews were not collectively responsible for the death of Christ. It was a small paragraph, but it was monumental. After nearly 2,000 years, the Church stepped back. The myth was no longer doctrine. Once the betrayer of Christ became the imagined enemy of the nation state, conspiracies replaced Scripture. Pamphlets replaced sermons. Schools revised curricula, sermons rephrased. Statues remained, but were now questioned. Museums were built, memorials erected. Survivors spoke, and so, in Russia, Austria, Germany, and France, the myth wore new clothes but carried old intentions. Diderot Montesquieu, Beldet, questioned inherited prejudice, even if their own writings were not free from bias. His trial divided a nation, the 20th century, but this time writers like Émile Zola cried out in protest. Intellectuals rallied. The wall, once strengthened by silence, now trembled under scrutiny. France, under revolutionary fervor, granted Jews full citizenship. Napoleon Bonaparte, complex and contradictory, upheld these rights even as he convened the Grand Sanhedrin to define Jewish loyalty. Emancipation spread slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly. In their challenge to dogma, they weakened the wall. It had armed a regime with centuries of belief. The wall, so long maintained by tradition and power, collapsed under the weight of its victims. He had absorbed Puritan notions that Jews would play a role in divine history and perhaps even in redemption. The myth of betrayal was not destroyed, but repurposed. The enemy became an instrument, and in that awkward conditional acceptance, a space was made. In this final part of Segment 8, we do not rush. We move slowly, carefully. Let us return to the early 16th century and the Reformation. In Poland, candles are lit where ghettos once stood. In Spain, Jewish culture is reclaimed. Synagogues restored not as relics, but as sites of continuity. In the United States, Jewish literature fills libraries. Jewish voices fill Congress. He engaged Christian thinkers, translated the Torah into German, and insisted on a shared human dignity. His friendships and letters, exchanged with Christian intellectuals, represented a new model. No longer enemy or convert, the Jew could now be citizen, colleague, peer. Martin Luther, bold and divisive, challenged Catholic authority in ways that shook Europe to its foundations. At first, he held out hope that Jewish communities would flock to his reformed vision of Christianity, now free of papal corruption. His early writings show a measure of admiration, or at least curiosity. But when that hope was not fulfilled, His tone darkened. He turned, instead, to the oldest tools of contempt. He revived slanders, demanded expulsions, and called for the burning of Jewish homes and synagogues. It is a chilling reminder of how even the champions of reform could lean on the old myth to rally support and consolidate power. Yet the world was changing. The fragmentation of Christian authority, so long the bedrock of the myth's power, now allowed for variance for debate. Some Protestant sects looked not with hostility, but fascination, toward Jewish texts and practices. The Dutch Republic, shaped by Calvinist tolerance and mercantile pragmatism, became a haven for Jewish exiles from Spain and Portugal. In Amsterdam, synagogues flourished in the open, Jewish printers produced Bibles and dictionaries, and a modest but significant integration unfolded. This was not a golden age. Prejudice persisted. Meanwhile, in England, the tides shifted. Jews had been expelled in 1290, but by the mid-17th century, they returned quietly with the hesitant permission of Oliver Cromwell. The Enlightenment expanded that space. With it came the Age of Reason, where philosophers asked not what was divinely decreed, but what could be rationally justified. In this soil, the Haskalatha, Jewish enlightened Mangru, Moses Mendelssohn, philosopher and translator, urged his fellow Jews to embrace secular knowledge while maintaining faith. The revolutions of the late 18th century gave legal form to this shift. But the myth adapted in the 19th century. The Dreyfus affair in France encapsulated this. A Jewish officer, falsely accused of treason, became the scapegoat of a nervous republic. And then, the Holocaust was not medieval. When Auschwitz was liberated, the myth was laid bare. Its consequences could no longer be spiritualized or rationalized. It had built a machinery of death, and in its ruins, in 1965, the Second Vatican Council issued Nostra Aetate. Education changed, and still the work continues. In Berlin, school children study the Shoah, not as distant tragedy, but as national memory. And in all of this, the myth loses ground. Yes, anti-Semitism still exists, because we have stories now, and memory, and records, and you, listening now in the quiet of this night, let us end not in triumph, but in peace. The wall is not entirely gone, but it is thin, and light passes through. So rest now, let your breath slow. Let the centuries fade, and know that the story continues. Not with betrayal, but with resilience. Not with silence, but with truth. Not with power, but with memory. Legacies of Blame. Medieval Narratives in Modern Shadows, Part 1. How the medieval accusations echoed. Through the centuries it begins, not with words, but with echoes, whispers passed down through generations, carried in books, sermons, street names, paintings, laws, and silences. These were not merely footnotes in the history of Europe, but living and breathing parts of the cultural atmosphere. Behind the Enlightenment of the Renaissance, behind the secularism of the 19th century, behind even the scientific modernity of the 20th, there was always the subtle hum of older stories. The tale of Jewish betrayal centered on the crucifixion. Expanded through the blood libel, stretched through the myth of global conspiracy, formed a thread that stitched together centuries of misunderstanding. The infamous Judenso motif, showing Jews suckling from a pig, was more than artistic cruelty, was public theology. But the art of the period tells a more complicated story. In fact, it amplified it. Pamphlets spread quickly. Anti-Jewish sermons were transcribed and distributed. Blood libel cases like those of Simon of Trent, William of Norwich. These tales, riddled with fabrication, entered schoolbooks, prayer manuals, and folklore collections. Giotto Fra, Angelico, Caravaggio, they painted religious scenes with beauty and reverence, but also preserved the visual coding of difference. When something goes wrong, an economic crash, a natural disaster, a plague, it is the old story, not the new evidence that the frightened mind reaches for. In 1348, when the Black Death ravaged Europe, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. Entire communities were wiped out, not because of proof, but because of the legacy of betrayal. Judas always marked Jewish elders, always stylized into sinister caricature. The Pale of Settlement, imposed by the Russian Empire, confined millions of Jews to a narrow corridor of land. It claimed to reveal a secret Jewish plan for world domination. The document was a forgery, a plagiarized patchwork of earlier political satire. but it became one of the most widely circulated anti-Semitic texts of the 20th century. It was cited by Nazis, Arab nationalists, American isolationists. It was believed pogroms, violent riots targeting Jewish communities, became a feature of 19th century life. These attacks were often justified with appeals to medieval myth: desecration of the host, murder of children, betrayal of nation. In Spain, the Converso and Morano laws punished those who had converted from Judaism for any sign of Judaizing practices, in T.S. Eliot's poems. In G.K. Chesterton's essays, in newspapers and radio shows, the myth adapted. It persisted. It shaped the minds of the educated and uneducated alike. Even generations later, individuals were investigated for their ancestry. It simply relocated. It dressed itself in anti-Sionist clothing. It moved into academic discourse. It aligned itself with both far-right and far-left ideologies. The betrayal myth was updated, repurposed. The symbols changed, but the logic remained. Thinkers across Europe and the United States embraced a perverse blend of Darwinism, anthropology, and racial theory. Jews were classified not as a religion, but as a race biologically distinct, supposedly unassimilable. Writers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Gobino wrote voluminous treatises arguing that Jews were intellectually dangerous, culturally corrosive. In Italy, ghettos remained active into the 19th century to challenge the sediment, to illuminate the corners. Scattered, however, the Second Vatican Council issued Nostra Aetate, the World Council of Churches. Historians played a vital role in dismantling the myth. In the years after World War II, a new generation institutions, such as the Pontifical Biblical Institute, Yad Vashem, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum developed joint programs and research partnerships. Of two, there was art. Painters, statues that once depicted Jews in mockery were contextualized or removed. Memorials rose in towns that had once hosted pogroms. Even with all this, the myth found new hosts. The internet allowed ancient accusations to travel at digital speed. Conspiracy theories, echoing the protocols, gained traction in online forums. Populist leaders trafficked in coded language. In some churches, old teachings lingered in small corners of tradition, passed from elder to novice like a treasured secret. Resistance remained. In Worms, there is a louder voice of correction. For every digital slander, a fact-checking rebuttal. For every resurgence of the betrayal myth, 1,000 students armed with history, Speyer, and mind centers of Jewish with conversation, with lit candles in the face of shadows. Life in medieval Germany public in this twilight of segment 9. We prepare to move toward reflection, toward quiet, toward the understanding that unlearning takes time and that healing does not erase, but it softens. Plaques now honor what was lost and acknowledge how it was lost. Poets, filmmakers, and playwrights began to wrestle with the legacy, Germany. The resistance is met with response, but no myth is eternal. In particular, undertook a massive educational campaign. It likely never will be, but it continues. Every schoolchild would visit a concentration camp. Every curriculum would address the history of anti-Semitism, not as distant misdeed, but as national inheritance. In the resilience of Jewish communities who refuse to be defined by victiahood, in the scholars who translate ancient texts with care, in the children who grow up learning to ask better questions. Scholars emerged, too, is part of history with calm resistance, a determination to uncover the full scope of anti-Semitism as historical roots. Their research exposed the mechanisms through which lies were sanctified and laws were poisoned by prejudice. Anglican Synods, a French Jewish historian and Holocaust survivor, who documented Christian anti-Semitism and directly influenced Vatican reform. His book, Jesus and Israel, became a foundational text, challenging Christians to reconcile their faith with historical truth. Isaac argued not against Christianity, but for its purification, one that abandoned hatred in favor of the original teachings of love and justice. Textbooks were rewritten. Gone were the illustrations of Judas as a hook-nosed traitor. Gone were the insinuations that Jews had rejected God. In their place were accounts of shared history, honest explanations of past injustice, and efforts to humanize both traditions. And evangelical forums began issuing statements acknowledging their historical role in perpetuating anti-Semitism. These declarations were often accompanied by educational reforms. Interfaith organizations emerged, committed to building understanding. Groups like the Council of Christians and Jews in the UK, the American Jewish Committee, these gatherings became spaces where old myths were named, examined, and set aside, such as revising Sunday school curricula and removing anti-Jewish language from liturgical texts. It was not erasure, it was restoration. From pulpits and classrooms, a new generation of Catholics would be taught to see Jews not as eternal adversaries, but as fellow seekers of God. The centuries-old narrative of betrayal was formally and publicly rejected, a document that would become a milestone in Catholic-Jewish relations. For the first time in official church doctrine, it was declared that Jews should not be blamed, collectively or individually, for the death of Christ. The statement read, "What happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews, without distinction, then alive, nor against the Jews of today, would see more decisive movements." Following the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust, Christian leaders could no longer ignore the cost of silence. The myth that Jews were cursed for betraying Jesus had helped prepare a cultural landscape in which genocide could take root. The theological reckoning was overdue. Voices in Catholic and Protestant circles began questioning the theological necessity of blaming Jews for Jesus' death. While still limited in scope, these voices represented the earliest moments of self-reflection. German theologians like Franz Delitzsch made early efforts to bridge Christian and Jewish texts, translating the New Testament into Hebrew and studying rabbinic sources. Delitzsch, while still a product of his time, offered an approach that acknowledged Jewish intellectual and spiritual traditions, marking a small but critical shift. In this final part of Segment 9, we will trace the deliberate, painstaking efforts undertaken by scholars, clerics, lawmakers, and citizens to confront, dismantle, and replace the ancient accusation that cast Jews as the betrayers of Christ and saboteurs of Christian society. This is not a tale of perfect redemption or swift justice. It is a slow turning, a gradual reckoning, built from the ground up by individuals who chose clarity over myth and compassion over fear. In the German states, even emancipated Jews often found their rights revoked or limited based on vague notions of social harmony. The move toward Reformation began not with explosive declarations, but with a cautious reevaluation of doctrine. It would take centuries for institutional Christianity to officially disavow the charge of collective Jewish guilt. But the first tremors began with theologians and pastors who recognized the harm of inherited language. In France, Germany, Russia, and Austria, national identity often meant Christian identity, and by extension, non-Jewish. It refined it, it systematized it. It translated centuries of whisper into shouting. The Nazis used medieval imagers as Judas, as devils, as ritual murderers alongside modern propaganda tools. Posters, films, schoolbooks, every medium was employed. Every narrative was bent toward the final goal: extermination. The response was thunderous. Protests erupted. Dreyfus was retried. He was found guilty again. Only after a prolonged campaign was he exonerated. Camps, bureaucracy. Catholic doctrine still included the charge of deicide, the belief that Jews collectively killed Christ. Every year, on Good Friday, congregations prayed for the perfidious Jews. This prayer, recited across centuries, was not simply a relic. It was an endorsement. It told the faithful, week after week, that the betrayal had not been forgiven. But it was also made possible by stories, by familiarity, by a myth so deeply embedded that it seemed natural to many who participated in or ignored the slaughter. And even then, the myth had already worked its damage. The Dreyfus Affair, which convulsed France from 1894 to 1906, exemplified how deeply embedded the myth remained. A Jewish captain in the French army was falsely accused of espionage. The evidence was weak, but the cultural narrative was strong. In frescoes and altarpieces, betrayal was not merely a story from the gospel, it was a template of identity. In eras where most people were illiterate, these images shaped understanding. The visual served as sermon. The grotesque served as instruction. The myths crafted in medieval courts and whispered in cloisters did not simply vanish when the Middle Ages ended. They embedded themselves in rituals, repeated symbols, and the structure of institutions. They became the quiet scaffolding upon which generations constructed ideas of difference, suspicion, and exclusion. To fully understand how these narratives lingered into modernity, one must imagine the layers of time not as separate chapters, but as overlapping veils. Let us consider art first. In cathedrals across Europe, from Chartres to Regensburg, sculptures depicted Jews with exaggerated, grotesque features, often mocking or desecrating sacred symbols. As Europe entered the Renaissance, many assumed that humanism and the rediscovery of classical texts would cleanse these old prejudices. The printed word, a revolution of the 15th century, did little to slow this myth's momentum. And still, the myth of betrayal endured and evolved. Law in the early modern period codified many of these prejudices. Let us pause to explore the social architecture of blame. The ritual of scapegoating does not require elaborate justification. It requires familiarity. These associations did not die with the Enlightenment. In fact, as nationalism rose in the 19th century, new identities were forged on exclusion. Émile Zola, the writer and intellectual, published his famous open letter J'accuse, accusing the French establishment of anti-Semitism. In Eastern Europe, now consider the rise of pseudoscience. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was in this period that the protocols of the Elders of Zion emerged, created by the Russian secret police, and the stage was set. The Third Reich did not invent anti-Semitism. The Holocaust was made possible by trains. Let us return briefly to the Church. Until the 1960s, in literature, even into the 20th century, echoes remained, and in the post-war world, even as the United Nations was founded and Israel declared independence, anti-Semitism did not vanish. So we pause here to reflect. Because if betrayal was once the cornerstone of exclusion, then memory must be the foundation of healing. In Part 2, we will look closely at the efforts within churches, classrooms, courtrooms, and communities to deconstruct these centuries of narrative, and to finally, gently, unlearn. Dismantling the myth, how the modern world fought back against ancient lies. The long shadow of the betrayal myth stretches across centuries, but even the longest shadows recede in the presence of sustained light. We begin, appropriately, with the Church, for it was within Christian institutions that the original betrayal myth had taken root and flourished. In the 19th century, the 20th century, in 1965, the significance of this document cannot be overstated. Other Christian denominations followed. Alongside these religious transformations, notable among them was Jules Isaac. The academic field of Jewish Christian studies expanded rapidly. Seminaries and universities began offering courses in interfaith dialogue, biblical criticism, and comparative theology. At the grassroots level, in schools, legal systems, and then, if medieval art had once carried the myth forward, then modern art would begin to confront it. The public square changed as well, and still, in some corners of society, but even here, for every whisper of suspicion, the work is not complete. It continues in the quiet courage of teachers who challenge a textbook, in the humility of preachers who revise a sermon. This, a slow not made with swords or protests, but with footnotes. The betrayal myth once loomed as unshakable, and now, so breathe deeply now, let go of the noise. You have seen the myth's rise, and you have now seen its unmaking. Let the rest come slowly. Let the silence be restful. And no, truth once named does not go quietly. Enduring myths, changing minds, the slow journey out of blame where shadows cling. Medieval echoes in the modern mind. As we enter this final segment, our last stretch through the winding corridors of time, imagine yourself standing in a long, echoing hall. The stones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air is cool, almost still, and somewhere in the distance, a quiet hum rises and falls, the echo of stories told and retold again and again. It is not about what happened, but about what endured, how certain ideas, born in ancient texts and medieval fears, managed to outlive their time, and how, in quiet corners of our modern world, they still linger, still whisper, still shape the way people think, react, and remember. This is the space of memory, not personal memory, but the deeper cultural kind. And still, it remains largely unchallenged, passed from parent to child, from preacher to congregation, from politician to crowd. Figures like Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Wilhelm Marr give it intellectual sheen. School plays still cast Judas in the familiar mold. Easter homilies, though gentler in tone, still sometimes speak of collective guilt, of ancient sins carried by a people. Newspapers print caricatures that echo medieval woodcuts. And all the while, in the background, Judas stands silent. Europe has emerged from the Great War, battered and unsure. The world is modern, fast, electric. But beneath the surface, old anxieties churn. Economic instability, social upheaval, and political uncertainty create fertile ground for ancient narratives to re-emerge. In Germany, a new movement begins to rise. It does not speak in the language of faith, but of purity, destiny, and blood. Never mentioned outright, but always there his betrayal, now symbolic of a deeper, darker claim to what centuries of quiet blame and whispered suspicion have created. In 1945, the camps are opened, the photographs emerge, the names, the numbers. The world cannot look away. It shifted, transformed, and took on new forms. In others, it faded into subconscious habit, but rarely was it simply let go. Rarely was it calmly and fully undone. The old sermons persist, Nostra Aetate, revising liturgies. It moves like mist, soft, persistent, and nearly invisible at first. It begins in whispers, in footnotes, in revised sermons, in hesitant apologies that grow louder with each generation. Survivors bear silent witness with numbers etched into their skin, stories stitched into their memory, entire towns without names. This is the quiet labor of Helena, long, often thankless task that continues even now. Updating catechisms. In schools, new curricula appear. In art and literature, new portrayals emerge. They look at medieval sermons, at passion plays, at PayPal bowls, at art, at law. And they see the line not straight, but undeniable, that runs from the lips of a medieval bishop to the loudspeakers of a Nazi rally. It affirms that Jews, today, and at the time of Jesus, cannot be held collectively responsible for his death. It condemns anti-Semitism without hesitation. One of the most significant is the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt in 1945, where Protestant leaders admit that the Church failed to resist Nazism and, by implication, the hatred that fueled it. It enters art, literature, film, and in these spaces, new voices begin to rise. Liturgical calendars are adjusted to remove references that once stirred blame. With prose that bleeds quiet sorrow, he describes not just what happened, but what it meant to believe, to hope, and to be betrayed by silence. Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, a documentary without narration, lets survivors speak. For over 9 hours, voices once silenced fill the screen. They do not speak of Judas, they speak of neighbors, of silence, of disbelief. Visitors walk among them in silence, unsure where it begins or ends. Each marks a life lost, a name, a birth, a deportation, a death. It is not a place of resolution, it is a space of confrontation. Churches remove anti-Semitic imagery. They sit in rooms with survivors who tell their stories calmly, again and again. In Poland, in Hungary, what images were they shown? And in this questioning, the shadow of Judas begins to thin. His characters do not accuse, they wrestle, they question, and in their questioning, they dismantle. Who was Jesus speaking to? Was blame ever meant to be collective? Parents no longer tell the old jokes. Grandparents speak not just of survival, but of what came before, of music, of books, of ordinary days. Jewish identity becomes not only resistance, but presence, and Christian identity no longer requires a villain. Slowly, they learn to distinguish history from interpretation. The old lines are underlined not to affirm, but to interrogate. The students read slowly, they ask questions, they write essays not on blame, but on perspective. They renounce anti-Semitism. They re-express the Gospels without the language of blame, in the minds of a few who still cling to simplicity over truth. Share meals. Theologians like Johann Baptist Metz and Edward Schillebeeckx explore how Christianity's narrative must change. It is the first time many people hear in granular detail the logistics of genocide, not as footnotes to Christian history, but as disciplines in their own right. Universities hire scholars to teach Hebrew, Yiddish, Jewish philosophy, medieval history, modern Zionism, and more. In learning, the myth loses ground. Survivors testify, bureaucrats speak. And though the word Judas is rarely mentioned, the echoes are present. They shimmer behind every accusation of betrayal, every image of conspiracy. The Jewish people become once again, the walls are plain, the air tinged with chalk and silence. A teacher tired but resolute opens a history book not with pride, but with purpose. Before the students can see the truth, they must unlearn the myth, and that is where this part of our journey begins. People, a brief but powerful document, declares that Jews as a people are not responsible for the death of Christ. In some classrooms, the textbooks still speak vaguely of ancient guilt. In some families, the jokes continue, softened by time but still sharp. Judas still walks, unspoken, the kind that nations, religions, and civilizations carry with them, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. And here, in this space, the myths we have explored so patiently, so gently, still live. They gather the fragments of old myths, polish them, weaponize them. They fade. A stillness in which we see that the betrayal myth did not stay in the past. Theologians and ordinary people who began, one by one, to dismantle the myth, who chose memory over tradition, understanding over blame. It traveled, it evolved, and in small, silent ways, it still touches the world. They lose power, they shrink, but only if we continue to see them, to name them, to tell their story, clearly, gently, fully. In their speeches, their posters, their policies, we hear not new ideas, but old echoes. The story that once played out in stained glass and Easter sermons now plays out in camps and ledgers, in barbed wire and train schedules. Judas, though never named, is present in every accusation of treason, every warning about the hidden enemy. The betrayal is now national, racial, total. Segment 10 is not a recounting of events, but a reflection. The people here are no longer medieval, but the rituals are still familiar. The priest still tells the Easter story. The stained glass still glows with crimson light. And Judas still crouches in the background, forever clutching his silver, forever painted with a hooked nose, ragged beard, and fearful expression. No longer just a man, but a symbol, a warning. The story of Judas Iscariot and the tragic myth of Jewish betrayal did not die with the Middle Ages. Imagine a village in 19th century Poland, or a quiet parish in rural France. It finds purchase in pamphlets, novels, even scientific theories. Racial theories, born in the salons of 19th century Europe, repackaged the myth of betrayal, in modern terms, no longer religious but biological. Only now he is accused not of killing Christ, but of poisoning society, controlling money, manipulating governments. The myth survives because it adapts, it blends. In Germany, by the dawn of the 20th century, anti-Semitism has become an accepted part of nationalist thought. Even in places more tolerant Britain, the United States, parts of Scandinavia, the old myths find quieter expressions. Children's books depict Jewish characters with sinister smiles, and so the myth lingers. And then Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen. The myth that began in pulpits ends in ash. And after what then? The world wakes up. But myths do not die easily. In some churches, it is only in the 1960s, with the Second Vatican Council, that the Catholic Church formally rejects the idea of collective Jewish guilt. Other denominations follow, but here's the quiet truth. Myths do not disappear, and so, this part of our journey, the first part of our final segment, is a moment of recognition. In part 2, we will look more closely at the unmaking, at the educators, artists. For now, let the echoes soften. Let the long corridor of memory grow quiet, and know that even the deepest myths can be rewritten. Quiet, unmaking. The gentle work of memory. Imagine the hush of a post-war classroom. The unmaking of the betrayal myth is not dramatic. It does not unfold in revolutions or riots. We begin in the decades following World War II. The world is graving. The scale of the Holocaust is incomprehensible. In this silence, something stirs. A question: how did we get here? And slowly, historians, educators, and theologians begin to answer. They trace the roots not just of Nazism, but of the story that made such cruelty imaginable. In 1961, the world watches the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. In response, theologians begin to write anew. In Germany, where the myth was most deeply embedded, pastors draft public confessions. Later, the evangelical church in Germany issues more direct statements. This theological shift culminates in Nostra Aetate, issued by the Second Vatican Council in 1965. In just 5 paragraphs, centuries are undone. The document acknowledges the spiritual heritage shared between Christians and Jews. These words do not erase history, and once doctrine changes, everything else begins to shift. Religious education transforms. New catechisms are written, textbooks are revised. But the work of unmaking the myth extends beyond the pulpit. Take the novels of Elie Wiesel or consider Chaim Patak, who writes of Jewish youth navigating identity in a world still suspicious of their belonging. In film, too, the myth is challenged. In these works, the myth is not attacked, it is replaced. Public memorials become part of the landscape. In Berlin, 2,711 concrete slabs formed the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, each one different, each one cold. In Paris, small brass plaques called Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, are embedded in sidewalks. These stones are not monuments. They are interruptions, reminders, warnings. And yet, perhaps the most powerful work is done not in public, but in classrooms. In Germany, Holocaust education is mandatory. Students visit camps, they study diaries, they ask questions. This education is not only about remembering the dead, it is about understanding the myth that made them vulnerable. Children are taught to question. Why did people believe what they believed? Even theology students now read texts differently. They ask, what does this gospel really say? And in homes too, the shift occurs. In interfaith dialogue, leaders sit across from one another not to convert, but to listen. Jewish rabbis and Christian priests walk together in old cities, retracing steps once soaked in suspicion. They pray together, publish statements together. None of this undoes the past. Let us now return to where we began, the classroom. The teacher opens the book again, but now the margins are filled with notes, and outside the window, the world continues. Cars pass, leaves fall, bells ring, but the myth is quieter now. It is still there in some corners, on fringe websites, but around them rises a counterweight, a great, slow, peaceful tide of memory. Because memory, when shaped by compassion, is stronger than myth. Because education, when shaped by humility, outlasts accusation. Because art, when shaped by truth, outshines dogma. And because people, gentle, curious, enduring, can learn, a soft light remains. Closing the circle with memory and peace, let us return one final time to the rhythm of slow breaths and flickering candles. Let the quiet draw closer now. Let your shoulders rest a little deeper into stillness. The room around you fades into shadow and hush, and all that remains is the voice of the past gentle measured echoing softly through the folds of time, from whispered rumors in crowded marketplaces to proclamations from kings and pulpits, from moments of unspeakable cruelty to glimmers of hope in ink, thought, and revolution. Through all of it, we have followed one thread, a myth ancient, potent, and dangerous, with a question, a hesitation, someone perhaps a monk copying a manuscript in a quiet abbey centuries ago, or a teacher writing a lesson plan in a modern classroom asks, but is this really what happened? They noted that early Christians, writing decades after the crucifixion, were trying to distance themselves from Judaism and appease Roman authorities. The Gospels reflect the anxieties of their time after the destruction of the temple, after the scattering of Jewish communities, after the first waves of persecution, and the silence that follows is not fear, but space. A space for answers, for reconsideration. And then, the darkest chapter, the Holocaust. 6 million Jewish lives lost. The unimaginable scale of violence. The industrial precision of extermination. Not after the piles of shoes, the numbers tattooed on forearms, the voices of survivors. And beneath it all, centuries of mythic idea that this people, these neighbors and citizens and families, were different, dangerous, damned. The idea that the Jewish people, collectively and eternally, were guilty of betraying Jesus. Myths, like embers, can reignite with a careless breath. Slowly, patiently, visitors walk the path of memory in the old Jewish quarter. In New York, students sit in quiet rooms and listen to recordings of survivors, their voices shaking but unwavering. In Spain, synagogues once silent are now homes to festivals of Jewish music. In France, laws are passed to protect religious freedom. In Israel, scholars study not only ancient texts, but also medieval sermons from Europe to understand how the myth evolved. We've come a long way together, from the tangled streets of medieval towns to the cold silence of stone cathedrals. Stories once told in hatred are retold with care. Myths once accepted are now dissected, questioned, and most importantly, replaced. In 1965, Nostra Aetate was published a declaration from the Second Vatican Council that formally rejected the notion of collective Jewish guilt. It was only a few paragraphs long, but it had taken nearly 2,000 years to write. We arrive at the point where lies lose power, where myths are softened by memory, and where truth is finally given a place to sit quietly. The Last Supper, once rendered with Jewish features as monstrous, began to be drawn with sensitivity, with historical honesty. Now, we reach the end of that path. Not the end of anti-Semitism, not the end of injustice, but the end of the story we have told about the story itself. They pray, they celebrate, they write, they laugh, they remember. Imagine, if you will, a quiet room. A window slightly open, the scent of wood smoke in the air. Outside a garden, perhaps there is a bench beneath a tree. It is the courage to look back and say, that was wrong. And the gentleness to say, this is how we move forward. You sit there, alone but not lonely. The air is cool, a single candle flickers nearby. Memory for them is not just a record, it is a thread that binds generations. There is no sudden rupture in the tale. No date we can circle on a calendar, not to dwell in suffering, but to honor resilience. To teach not just what was endured, but what was created: music, philosophy, stories, ethics, rituals. Life with a shared understanding that something once held up as truth was, in fact, a shadow. In a teacher's gentle correction, in the decision to tell a different story, history became a field. Theology became comparative. People began to look at the Bible not only as a sacred document, but also as a product of its time. They studied the Roman occupation of Judea, the politics of Herodian kings, the structure of ancient trials and punishments. What emerged was not clarity, but nuance. And in that nuance, the old accusation that the Jews killed Christ began to lose its grip and declare, here is when the myth ended. That is not how belief dissolves. Myths do not die with a bang. They fade. They wear away. They unravel strand by strand, until one day you realize you haven't heard the old words in quite some time. And even when you do, they sound different, fainter, as if ashamed of themselves. It begins with noticing. In the 19th century, this questioning began to take on form and discipline. Scholars pointed out that Roman crucifixion was a state punishment, not one handed down by Jewish law. This insight did not immediately change public opinion, but it was a seed. Other seeds followed: the rise of secular philosophy, the gradual emancipation of Jews in European nations, the shift from religious to nationalistic anti-Semitism, the rise and fall of empires. The world could no longer pretend, not after Auschwitz, not after Bergen-Belsen. The Catholic Church, slow and immense, moved at last. Other churches followed. Statements were issued, apologies made. In classrooms, textbooks were revised. In art, new images were painted. Judas became a complex figure. And yet, even in this softening, echoes remained. Jokes told in private, graffiti on synagogue walls, internet conspiracies in some places. The old sermons are still preached. In some hearts, the old hatred still flickers, so the work continues. In Berlin, school children walk silently through Holocaust memorials. Museums, films, novels, poems all help reshape the narrative. And what of the Jewish people? They remain. They have always remained. Despite exile, pogroms, ghettos, inquisitions, and genocide, Jewish communities persist. Jewish writers, artists, thinkers, teachers, and children all carry this memory forward. As we come to the end of this long and heavy history, let us pause in stillness. This is where the myth ends, not with a proclamation, but with a question answered, not with a final word, but with silence. And now the light remains. It is dim, yes, but steady. It burns in libraries, in classrooms, in letters written by one friend to another. We do not need the myth anymore. We never did. What we need is kindness and patience and memory, because history is not just dates and names. It is the act of choosing what to remember and how. So breathe now. Let your shoulders fall. Let your thoughts grow quiet. You have walked a long road through time, through ancient streets and darkened chambers, through cathedrals and camps, through silence and song, and here you are at peace. The candle flickers one last time, and in that flame is all that remains. Memory, truth, light, not blame, not betrayal, not fear, just peace, just stillness, just the quiet knowledge that myths can fade, and that in their place something kinder may grow. Sleep now. Let the night carry you gently. Let the rhythm of history dissolve. Let the old stories rest. And let the truth remain.